Some crimes leave behind more questions than answers. Some deaths remain shrouded in mystery, their stories buried in time, whispered only through fragments, clues, and the echoes of fear. Tonight, we step into the shadows of history, into the lives of those who vanished, those who endured, and those whose final moments remain unsolved. These are stories of survival, of terror, the unexplained real-life crimes and mysterious deaths that will challenge what you think you know about the world. From chilling kidnappings to baffling disappearances, from brutal family murders to inexplicable tragedies in remote places. We will explore events that defy explanation, yet left an indelible mark on the lives of victims and the minds of those who seek the truth. Prepare yourself to confront the unknown, to walk the line between fear and fascination, and to remember that sometimes reality is far more terrifying than fiction. Because these are the stories that history refuses to forget. And tonight, you will not forget them either. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 1969, the vanishing of Dennis Martin. The mountains breathed mist that morning. Thick coils of vapor drifted between the trees like pale fingers, curling around trunks slick with last night's rain. The forest smelled of wet moss, crushed leaves, and something else, something metallic and sour carried on a low wind that rolled down from the high peaks. The Martin family hiked up the worn trail toward Spencefield, boots sinking into the soft soil. Each step released the scent of earth and decay, a reminder that in these woods, things vanished into the ground faster than anyone realized. Dennis clung close to his father at first, small footsteps, trying hard to match large ones. But when they reached the clearing, the trees parted just enough to let sunlight spill in, warm and deceptive. The kids darted out immediately, laughter scattering into the branches like startled birds. Dennis followed, his grin flashing briefly as he hid behind a rhododendron thicket. His red shirt flickered like a spark before disappearing behind a green wall. Then came the plan: simple, childish, innocent, sneak up, jump out, make the grown-ups yell in surprise. The Martins chatted lazily, unaware of the forest's breathless stillness. Even the insects seemed muted, their endless buzz reduced to a faint hum. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pushing down on shoulders and lungs alike. The kids split up, to circling left, Dennis circling right. A rustle, a tiny giggle, a flash of red cloth, and silence. The boys leaped from the brush, shouting triumphantly. Their faces shone with sun and sweat until confusion sank in. One spot remained empty. Behind the thicket, the leaves lay perfectly untouched, not bent, not disturbed, no footprints in the loose soil. No drag marks, just stillness. Dennis's father called his name, the sound echoing strangely. It hit the tree line and was swallowed whole. Again, louder, sharp. Nothing. The wind picked up suddenly, harsh enough to rattle branches, and somewhere beyond the ridge came a sound thin, high, stretched too long to be a child's voice. A scream, a wail. Something caught between the two. A ranger later insisted it was an animal. The mother said no animal screamed like that. Searchers fanned out, combing the slope. They found torn earth halfway down the far side, as if something had slid or been dragged. But the dirt looked too smooth, too controlled, not chaotic like a fall, not jagged like a struggle. Almost as if the earth had reshaped itself afterward. A tuft of moss lay ripped away in a clean circle. No footprints, no handprints, no sign of weight. Just the scent metallic, sour stronger here than anywhere else. Night settled fast, smothering the ridge in darkness. Flashlights cut thin tunnels through the trees, but the beams seemed weak, swallowed before they reached the next trunk. The forest pressed in, suffocating, heavy with damp air and something unseen. At 2 a.m., the wind died. Utter stillness. Then, footsteps, soft light, uneven circling just beyond the glow of camp lanterns. Not the heavy tread of men, not the skitter of animals. Smaller, bare. Moving with an unsettling rhythm, pausing every few seconds as if listening. A ranger whispered Dennis's name. The footsteps stopped. Silence tightened like a fist. After a long moment, the steps resumed faster, now moving uphill into the trees before fading completely. Search dogs brought to the slope whimpered, refused to enter the brush. One lay flat on the ground, shaking violently, eyes fixed on the dark undergrowth. Handlers couldn't coax them forward. A sudden metallic ringing echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods, like a distant door slamming or steel striking stone. The sound was horribly out of place, jarring, hollow, and gone as quickly as it came. Over the next days, the scent of rot spread across sections of the forest with no bodies, no animals, no explanation. Hikers miles away reported hearing a child's voice drifting between the trees at dusk then, cracked, carried by a wind that didn't touch the leaves. One man insisted he saw a small figure crouched behind a log near the creek weeks later, pale, motionless, watching, but when he blinked, it was gone. The forest never returned Dennis Martin, and the clearing at Spence Field still feels wrong. Too quiet, too still, like the woods are holding their breath, waiting. Yosemite National Park, 1981. The disappearance of Stacey Aris, the high Sierra sun, felt sharp enough to cut skin, reflecting off the granite domes in a blinding shimmer. The air carried the dry scent of dust, sagebrush, and something faintly electrical, like the crackle right before a storm. Horses snorted uneasily as the group arrived at Sunrise High Sierra Camp, their hooves shifting across loose stone as if searching for steadier ground. The camp sat perched on a plateau ringed by silent fir trees, their shadows long and thin in the afternoon light. Tents stood rigid, canvas stretched tight as if bracing against something coming. The wind drifted through in slow, inconsistent breaths, sometimes still, sometimes pushing with a strange rhythmic pulse. Stacy stepped down from her horse, legs stiff, eyes drawn to the massive boulder just beyond the cabins. It rose from the earth like a tooth, pale and jagged, its surface warm under the sun. Yet a coldness seemed to radiate from the shadow behind it. He turned to tie off the horse. She rounded the boulder. Sunlight brightened the air around her, and then she vanished. The absence struck immediately, abrupt, unnatural void. Her father called her name, voice too loud in the quiet camp. It echoed across the ridge, thin and hollow, swallowed by the tree line with frightening speed. Behind the boulder, the soil lay smooth, no footprints leading away, no sign of movement in the dust. Her camera lens cap sat on the ground, but the strap was gone. The air felt colder here, a chill that seeped through clothes, despite the heat of the day. Searchers combed the area, boots crunching over gravel, spread out along the slope, fanning into the trees. The forest grew dense quickly, thick trunks rising like pillars, their branches forming a dark cathedral overhead. A ranger paused at the edge of a cluster of trees. Something felt wrong. The air in that patch sat heavy, thick like wet wool, muffling sound. Even the birds avoided the space, circling above instead of landing. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped 5 degrees instantly. The smell hit him first, a mix of cold stone and something else. Faint but sharp, like the scent released when old photographs are opened after decades. In he called her name. His voice died in his throat, swallowed by the air. Through the trees, high on the slope, something pale flickered. A glimpse of a figure slipping behind a distant trunk. Human height. Maybe. But the movement was too fluid, too quiet, as if gliding rather than walking. He scrambled uphill, boots sliding against loose rock. When he reached the tree, the space behind it was empty. No footprints, no disturbed pine needles, just silence pressing in from all sides. The ranger felt something watching him, not from a single direction, every direction at once. He backed away. By evening, the camp grew tense. Strange static hummed through the air, barely audible but present, vibrating deep in bone and muscle. The horizon glowed orange with the setting sun, casting long shadows across the open plateau. The granite boulder threw a massive blade of darkness toward the tents. Someone swore they heard a voice whispering around the back of the cabins, soft, urgent, like someone trying not to cry. When they followed the sound, it vanished between one breath and the next. Light dropped fast. The stars came out sharp and cold, thousands of tiny white sparks pinned against the sky. The temperature plummeted. The wind died completely, leaving only the faint crackle of dry brush shifting under its own weight. Just after midnight, a scream rang out from the ridge above camp. Short, high, human. The search team lunged uphill, flashlights shaking wildly. Beams danced across boulders and trees, moving too fast to settle on anything. Halfway up the ridge, the air grew unnaturally still again. Then came the footsteps, fast, light, skittering across stone somewhere ahead of them. Not animal. Too straight, too purposeful, too familiar, the ranger called out. The footsteps stopped instantly. Silence. The light from one flashlight flickered, dimmed, and shut off entirely. Another followed. Panic rose, breaths quickening. Something moved in the dark nose shape, just the impression of movement, the sensation of displacement. One man later said it felt like the night itself brushed past him, cold enough to burn. When dawn broke, the ridge looked unchanged. Calm, pale, silent, no tracks, no torn clothing, no broken branches. Just the untouched slope, as if the night had reset the world like smoothing a bedsheet. Searchers ranged miles outward. Horses refused to go near certain groves. Now dogs would not track the scent. They spun in frantic circles, whining, then lay down trembling, refusing to move. Days passed. The air grew heavier with each search. Some said the forest felt like a sealed room, holding its breath. Others reported hearing whispers carried on breezes that moved nothing else. Not the branches, not the branches, not the dust. A backpacker several miles away claimed he saw a girl standing motionless near a switchback trail at dusk. Pale shirt, still posture, he raised his hand to call out. She stepped behind a tree. He reached the tree minutes later. No one stood there, but the ground felt warm beneath his feet, as if someone had been standing in that exact spot for a very long time. The forest at Sunrise High Sierra Camp returned to its stillness. But hikers say that sometimes at the edge of the plateau near that cold-shadowed boulder, they see a flash of movement, a flicker of color, the shape of a young girl turning the corner and disappearing all over again. Chattahoochee National Forest 2002. The disappearance of Christopher Tompkins' early morning light seeped through the Georgia pines in thin, watery streaks. Dew clung to blades of grass like tiny glass beads, trembling with every shift of wind. The forest floor smelled of damp soil, lingering fog, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. A narrow gravel road cut crookedly through the woods, its edges swallowed by talons of grass and creeping vines. For survey workers trudged along the shoulder, boots crunching through gravel. Their measuring equipment clattered softly with each step. Christopher walked slightly behind the others, his orange vest bright against the forest's muted pallor. The trees on either side grew unnervingly, close-stalled, dense, crowding the road like they were leaning in to listen. Birds called from high branches, but the deeper woods beneath them were silent, too silent. The kind of silence that settled like weight, thick and unmoving, pressing against the ears. Christopher glanced into the undergrowth as he walked. Something about the shadows felt wrong. They shifted behind the trees slowly, as if crawling out of sight each time he turned his head. The others talked ahead of him, their voices rising and falling casually. The crunch of gravel beneath their feet kept a steady rhythm. Christopher took one more step. Then he wasn't there. No sound, no shout, no crash through branches. Just a sudden, unnatural absence, like someone had snatched him from the world between one heartbeat and the next. The man directly ahead of him turned instinctively, sensing the break in the rhythm of footsteps. He saw nothing behind him but the empty strip of gravel, glistening with dew. "Chris, no answer?" he called louder. Only the wind sighed through the pine needles. The three workers spread out instantly, confusion tightening their breath. Their boots moved through the brush, pushing aside vines and brambles. They expected the sound of someone struggling, maybe a grunt of pain. Nothing, not even the rustle of disturbed leaves. The undergrowth on the roadside looked too neat and touched, as if no one had stepped through it at all. They retraced their steps, eyes scanning every inch of ground. Something glinted, small object lying in the grass. Single blue fiber, then another, and another. Christopher's work pants. The fibers formed a faint trail, drifting toward the tree line like breadcrumbs scattered by someone being pulled off balance. But the trail stopped after a few feet. Just stopped. Next, they found a single work boot on the ground, its laces snapped cleanly. Not frayed, not torn, snapped as though something had yanked it so violently the laces sheared apart. The ground around the boot was untouched. No footprints, no drag marks. The dew on the leaves remained unbroken, tiny droplets still clinging undisturbed. Something had taken him without disturbing a single blade of grass. The workers called his name until their throats scraped raw. Their shouts bounced off the trees and vanished, swallowed by the dense, unmoving air. Chris's mother later described the forest as heavy, though she wasn't there that day. Locals said the same thing. The woods along that road held a strange weight, as if they were full of held breath. Searchers combed the area that afternoon, spreading deeper into the pines. The forest grew darker quickly, shadows thickening, even though it was only midday. The undergrowth twisted into tangled shapes, some resembling hands reaching up from the earth, others like crouched figures frozen in place. Dogs were brought in. They walked a few yards into the trees, sniffed at the boot, then whimpered and retreated, pressing themselves against their handlers' legs, tails tucked hard. Attempts to force them forward ended in abrupt, frantic barking, directed at the dark space between two trees. An empty gap. Nothing visible moved there, but the dogs refused to look away, hackles rising in razor-sharp lines down their backs. The handlers pulled them back. Deeper in the woods, searchers found a strange set of disturbances on the forest floor. Small indentations in the pine needles, spaced far apart. Too far apart for human steps, too uniform for animal tracks. Almost like something had hovered or been lowered, lightly touching down between strides. 6 feet apart? 6 feet apart? The prints stopped suddenly beside a ditch. On the opposite side of the ditch, the ground was smooth, pristine, undisturbed. Night settled, let. Heavy clouds choked out the moon, leaving the forest in a suffocating darkness. Searchers' flashlights cast thin beams across the landscape, but the light felt weak, as though the dark had density something you could push against. One searcher froze. He heard it, breathing, not his own. A soft inhale and a longer, shaky exhale, coming from somewhere just behind him near a cluster of trees. He turned his light toward the sound. There was no one there. The breathing stopped instantly. But something else started, a faint tapping, sharp, rhythmic, like fingernails drumming on bark. 5 taps. Pause. 5 taps. A cold wind swept through suddenly, bending the tops of the trees while the lower brush remained perfectly still. The searcher backed away slowly, heart slamming in his chest. Something whispered his name, not Chris's name. His soft. Close. Too close. He ran. The next morning, the search resumed. In daylight, the forest looked normal, ordinary, almost comforting. But the deeper they went, the more wrong it felt. Birds gave the woods a wide berth. Squirrels avoided certain patches. Even insects seemed absent in spots, as if entire pockets of the forest repelled life. A hunter miles away later reported seeing a man crouched low in the trees at dusk close, dirty hair hanging over his face. The hunter called out, thinking the stranger might be injured. The figure shifted slightly, then stood. Its height was off, its limbs too long, its posture bent in a way the hunter couldn't place. He blinked. The figure was gone. The hunter refused to return to that section of forest. Authorities found no body, no clothing, no signs of a struggle. Christopher Tompkins had simply vanished, absorbed into the trees without sound, motion, or trace. Some of the workers refused ever to walk that road again. They said the tree line felt wrong, that when you walked beside it late in the afternoon, you could sense something standing between the trunks, watching, its gaze following every step. Quiet, patient, waiting. Crater Lake National Park, 2006. The disappearance of Sammy Bulk, the road to Crater Lake, twisted upward in narrow coils, climbing through thick evergreen forest. Pines rose tall on both sides, their needles whispering in a soft, eerie rhythm as the wind threaded through. The boy in the back seat stared out the window, watching the trees blur into long streaks of dark green. He tapped his fingers against the glass, humming a quiet, rhythmic sound, something only he understood. The sky above the forest was unnaturally blue, almost too bright, the sunlight sharp enough to sting the eyes. Crater Lake appeared suddenly through a gap in the trees, a vast bowl of cobalt water, impossibly still, reflecting the sky in a perfect mirror. The caldera walls dropped steeply, jagged and sheer, like the earth had been torn open by something ancient and violent. Sammy stepped out of the car, his sneakers crunching on gravel. The air smelled cold, despite the sunlight-clean pine, mineral-rich stone, and the strange, almost metallic chill that always clung to the lake's edge. His father adjusted the backpack straps, and closed the car door with a thud that echoed briefly across the overlook. Sammy wandered to the guardrail, entranced by the blue expanse below, his fingers twitching restlessly as he rocked lightly from heel to toe. A single raven perched on a dead branch nearby. Its feathers glistened like oil, its black eyes fixed on the boy. It cocked its head once, sharply as if making a decision. Sammy looked back at his father. Then he bolted, not far just up the slope. 10 feet, then 20. His father called his name, tone calm at first, then firmer. Sammy kept climbing. His small hands brushed over rocks the size of melons, his sneakers slipping slightly on loose pumice. He moved faster, driven by a burst of energy that made him almost giddy. The slope grew steeper, pine needles scattered underfoot. The trees thinned out as he ascended toward a ridge hidden by low branches. His father's voice rose again. Sammy didn't stop. He crested the ridge, turned slightly, looked back. For a second, a single breath, his father saw his outline against the sky. Small, still, watching. Then Sammy took one step sideways into the trees and vanished. His father reached the ridge seconds later. The forest beyond was dense, tangled, and unforgiving. A cold wind rolled down through the trees, brushing past his skin like icy fingers. No Sammy. Just the sound of branches swaying high above. Too high. Too slow, he shouted again. His voice cracked. Silence. Searchers arrived quickly. Radios crackled, boots stamped down, ferns and needles. The forest swallowed their voices, muffling everything. Search dogs sniffed the ground, but their heads jerked up instead, toward the tree line, ears flattening. One dog whined and backed away from a cluster of thick bushes, tail tucked so tightly it curled toward its belly. The brush in the direction Sammy had run was oddly uniform, undisturbed. No broken twigs, no footprints in the soft soil, not even a scuff on loose stone. It was as if the boy's steps had been erased. Ranger knelt and brushed the ground with gloved fingers. The pine needles felt wrong, damp and cold, but not the usual forest cold, deeper, clammy, like touching the inside of a freezer. He stood quickly, wiping his hands on his pants. They fanned outward. Forest grew darker, deeper they went, shadows collecting between trees like pooling water. Every trunk looked the same, straight, tall, smooth bark repeating endlessly, making it impossible to tell where they'd already been. One searcher held up a hand suddenly. He listened. There, very faint, a soft tapping sound, like a child knocking on wood with a stick. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, Sammy. Someone called. The tapping stopped instantly. Branches shifted high overhead, not the usual rustling of wind, but something heavier, more deliberate. A slow, dragging sound across bark. Something watching from above. The searchers scanned the canopy. Only silhouettes of thick branches. No birds. No squirrels. Nothing living. The wind died as abruptly as if a switch had flipped. The entire forest went still. Needles stopped moving mid-sway. Even the smallest leaves became motionless. Then a deeper sound began. A low hum vibrating through the trunks. Almost electric. Almost a voice. The team retreated several steps involuntarily. Radios hissed with static. One headset screeched, feedback so sharp it forced the wearer to rip the device off. Sammy's father kept searching long after others needed rest. He climbed ridges, pushed through brambles, scraped his arms and knees on rock and bark. Every time he thought he heard movement, a scuff, a quick step. A breath, he ran toward it. Nothing. The sun dipped behind the caldera rim, casting the forest in layers of deep orange, then red, then black. The lake reflected none of it still, dark, glass smooth. At twilight, a shape appeared on the ridge, small, still, facing away. Sammy's father froze, breath hitching. The figure took one step, then another, slow, deliberate. He whispered the boy's name. The figure jerked, just slightly like a puppet pulled by a string. Then it melted backward into the trees, dissolving into the shadows as though soaking into them. Police later said it must have been a trick of light, but his father insisted he'd seen the shape again 2 days later. Same place, same posture. unmoving, staring out toward the lake. Each time he approached, it slipped behind a trunk. Each time he followed, the space behind the trunk was empty. On the fourth day, searchers found a single rock turned over. The soil beneath was unnaturally cold frosted, though the daytime temperatures had been warm. Near the rock was a small indentation in the dirt. Not a footprint, more like the impression of a knee or a hand, pressed there for a very long time, as if something had crouched, watching. The forest eventually returned to its rhythm-whined birds, distant rustle. The lake gleamed blue again. Tourists came. Laughter echoed across the overlooks. But search teams avoided that ridge. Rangers quietly warned hikers not to stray uphill. Some evenings, as fog rolls in and the trees blur into silhouettes, people claim they see a small figure at the tree line, occluding slightly, head tilted, watching the lake. And sometimes just before it fades, they hear the faintest tapping on wood. Tap, 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 always 5 times. Timber Creek Campground, Idaho National Forest, 2015. The disappearance of Dorcoons Jr. The sun hung low above the mountains, casting warm gold across the narrow dirt road that wound toward Timber Creek Campground. Dust kicked up beneath the truck's tires, drifting lazily behind them in a thick plume. Pine trees crowded the roadside, ancient, tall, their trunks dark with sap, their branches tangled like grasping hands. The little boy sat in the back seat, legs dangling, boots tapping silently against the upholstery. His fingers toyed with a small metal toy truck, rolling it along the seat, eyes flicking toward the window in quick, excited bursts. The air smelled of sun-baked pine, distant campfire smoke, and the dry, mineral scent of earth warmed by the passing day. The forest hummed with a strange tension, to quiet in one moment. Then rustling with sudden bursts of wind, as though something large moved through the distant branches. The campground appeared at last, clearing carved into the wild with scattered rocks, rough-cut logs arranged around a cold fire pit, and tall pines enclosing the space in a near-perfect, suffocating circle. They parked. Doors swung open. The boy giggled as he hopped out, gravel crunching under his boots, ran toward the fire pit, his tiny shadow flickering across the stones. The grandfather stared at the tree line with squinted eyes as though something about the forest bothered him. He rubbed his neck. His breath came slow and shallow. He said nothing. A distant creek murmured softly through the forest, its trickling sound oddly steady like a heartbeat. The adults chatted, unpacking coolers and folding chairs. The boy wandered near his father at first, tugging playfully at his pant leg, then toddled toward the truck again for his blanket. His boots scuffed lightly against dirt and pine needles. He walked 10 steps, then 15. Then he moved behind the pickup truck. His father glanced over, saw the flash of blonde hair near the tailgate. The father bent to move a cooler. 30 seconds passed. When he looked again, the space behind the truck was empty. The father called the boy's name, the sound sharp and slightly strained. It bounced off the surrounding trees with a strange hollowness, as though the forest had too much mass, too much density, swallowing the voice hole before it could travel. He searched behind the truck, then around it, then circled the fire pit. Oh boy. Just the stillness of the forest, pressing close on all sides. The grandfather said he thought the boy had been by him moments earlier, maybe down by the creek. He pointed toward a path descending through thick brush. The undergrowth there was darker than the rest dense, shadowed. The light twisted into thin threads that barely touched the forest floor. They called out again. Silence. A heavy silence, thicker than before. Something moved behind the tree line, the slightest shift. Too smooth to be wind, too quiet to be an animal. A dark shape dipped quickly behind a trunk. The adults froze, eyes fixed on the spot. Nothing emerged. They searched the path toward the creek. The water rushed over rocks with a steady hiss, cold spray misting the air. The ground near the bank was soft, muddy, perfect for capturing footprints. But there were no small prints, no marks at all, just untouched mud, smooth as a freshly wiped slate. The adults shouted louder, their voices cracking with rising panic. The forest returned no echo. It simply listened, breathing slow, patient. Search teams arrived quickly. Radios hissed with static as rangers moved through the clearing, calling the boy's name. Their flashlights cut long beams through the trees, even though daylight still lingered. One ranger knelt by the creek, running gloved fingers through the mud. "No prints," he muttered. His voice trembled slightly. They fanned outward. Boots crunched through brush, snapping twigs, sending small birds darting into the canopy. But deeper in the woods, even the birds fell silent, as though they understood something humans did not. A searcher spotted movement up the hill, something pale slipping between two pines. "Hold on," he shouted, sprinting uphill. When he reached the spot, he found only a hollow place in the brush where the ground looked compressed, as though someone had knelt there for a long time. The indentation was cold, much colder than the surrounding soil. Night fell quickly. Wind slithered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost metallic smell. The fire pit crackled unevenly, throwing thin shadows across the ground. The adults sat stiffly around it, listening to the forest breathe. Then, from far up the slope, came a soft cry. Short, high, a child's voice. Every head snapped upward. The sound echoed again, this time, much closer. They jumped to their feet and sprinted toward it, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches. Their flashlights jerked wildly, beams slicing through the dark. "Buddy!" the father yelled, voice breaking. The forest answered with silence so absolute it felt violent. Then, another cry, this time behind them. They spun around. The light from their flashlights bent strangely, as if the darkness was thickening, warping the beams. The air grew heavy, pressing against their ribs, making each breath labored. Shape moved between the trees. Small, fast, too fast. One searcher screamed for the others to stop, convinced something was circling them. The light swung, beams crossing erratically, as shadows shifted in dizzying, impossible ways. Then everything went still. The cries stopped. The wind stopped. Even the trees stopped swaying, branches frozen mid-arc. A single boot print appeared near the fire pit over Nita's. If pressed into the dirt by an invisible weight, it was tiny, fresh, perfectly formed. It faced the forest. Over the following days, searchers scoured every inch of the campground. Helicopters circled overhead. Cadaver dogs swept the area. Every log overturned, every bush inspected. Nothing. No scent, no clothing, no trail. Just the forest. Silent, unmoving, watching. Some locals later whispered that the Timber Creek woods had always felt wrong, that certain spots swallowed sound, that shadows sometimes lagged behind the objects casting them. The trees seemed to lean unnaturally when the wind blew in the boys' direction, as if something unseen moved through them. Searchers eventually left. Campers returned over the years. And occasionally at dusk, when the fire pit burns low and the forest grows still, someone hears small footsteps circling the clearing. Light, uneven, child-sized. They stop just outside the firelight, always just beyond where the glow can reach. And from the dark, a soft voice whispers so quiet it barely disturbs the air. "Dad?" Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 1976. The disappearance of Trenny Gibson, the forest floor was damp, slick with fallen leaves and pine needles compressed into a spongy carpet. Morning mist clung to the lower branches like ghostly veils, curling around tree trunks and weaving through the undergrowth. The mountains breathed slowly, each gust of wind carrying moisture, and the faint, sour tang of decaying wood. Trenny Gibson and her cousin hiked along a narrow trail that cut through a dense stretch of the Smokies. The path twisted sharply, moss-covered rocks protruding like jagged teeth. Their laughter echoed briefly, carried upward by the mist, then swallowed by the thick pines. Every footstep pressed down on the wet soil with a soft squelch. Leaves rustled, yet the forest beyond the trail remained silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Only the wind whispered a low, uneven sigh that seemed to shift in volume with each heartbeat. Trenny paused near a small clearing, looking at a patch of sunlight dappled through the canopy. The mossy rocks glistened, wet from the overnight fog. She stepped forward, pointing toward a broken log across the path. "Look," she said, crouching slightly. Her cousin leaned forward to see. One step, 2 steps. A snap of twigs sharp, sudden not from her. They froze. The forest seemed to exhale. A shadow passed just beyond the trees. Dark, elongated, moving with a fluid grace that didn't belong to a human. It slipped behind a large oak and vanished. Trenny's cousin turned, calling her name. No answer. Trenny had taken a single step off the trail. She was gone. The cousin ran forward, scanning the underbrush. branches snagged at sleeves, scraping skin. The mist had thickened, clinging to every surface. The forest swallowed sound, the rustle of clothing, the sharp inhale, the pounding heartbeat. Nothing emerged. Searchers later said the area smelled strange like cold iron and moss, damp yet acrid. Dogs refused to enter the clearing for more than a few feet. One dog whimpered, trembling, and would not advance. Its eyes stayed fixed on the dense tree line, as if expecting something to step out. The search party spread in concentric circles, flashlights stabbing through the mist. Each searcher reported a heavy, almost tangible pressure in the air. It wasn't the fog, it was the forest itself. It's thick, resistant, patient, branches bent in unnatural directions. Pine needles appeared disturbed in patterns, too deliberate for animals. Small stones were arranged in rings where none had been before. At dusk, one searcher swore he saw her, small figure, pale shirt, crouched behind a tree. She shifted, her hair glinting faintly in the last light of the sun. He called her name. She vanished, not running, not hiding. Vanished. The searchers continued for days. Each morning, the mist would settle differently, reshaping familiar paths. Rocks looked moved, fallen trees shifted. Footprints, when they appeared, were brief and incomplete. Sometimes a single shoe imprint, perfectly preserved, then nothing. One veteran ranger swore the forest hummed, low and rhythmic, when the search teams passed certain areas. A vibration you felt in the chest, not the ears. Some called it imagination. The searchers who stayed near it longer reported a chill that penetrated clothing and bone. At night, the mountains seemed to lean in. Campfires burned low. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the glow. Occasionally, from deep within the trees, soft, high-pitched laughter would echo faint, fleeting, impossible to locate. Search teams eventually left, unable to trace her further. Decades later, hikers report strange occurrences along that trail. A fleeting glimpse of a pale figure crouched behind a rock, the sensation of being watched from just beyond the tree line. Small footsteps echoing in damp leaves, then stopping suddenly. Objects out of place. A single shoe, a backpack, or a hat resting carefully atop a boulder. Some say the forest retains memory, that it remembers those it has taken. That the misty ridge trail itself reshapes to hold them, stretching space, bending time, swallowing them slowly, patiently, forever. No trace of Trenny Gibson was ever recovered. Only the forest remained quiet, heavy, and impossibly still. Olympic National Park. Washington, 2015. The disappearance of Benjamin Gibbs. The rain fell in thin, steady sheets, soaking the moss-laden forest floor. Every branch, every fallen log, glistened as if coated in liquid glass. Fog rose from the wet earth in long, curling wisps that hung suspended in the air, obscuring anything beyond a few feet. The roar of distant waterfalls mixed with the soft patter of raindrops, a chaotic symphony that masked the smaller, subtler noises of the woods. Benjamin Gibbs trudged along a narrow trail, water soaking through his boots, each step squishing softly into mud. The canopy above was thick. Light barely reached the forest floor. Pine needles and decaying leaves coated the ground, muffling his footsteps. He carried a small backpack and a map, checking it every few minutes. The path twisted sharply, leading into the denser, unmarked wilderness of the park. Every now and then, a branch would snap knot under his feet, not from wind, but somewhere in the shadows beyond the trail. Small, sharp, sudden. Benjamin paused, scanning the trees. Mist curled at eye level, obscuring shapes and making familiar trees seem alien. The silence that followed the snapping of branches pressed in unnaturally, as if the forest were holding its breath. He took a few steps forward. The trail seemed to shift beneath him, physically but perceptually. Trees that had been to the left now appeared to the right. The slope felt steeper than it had moments ago. His boots sank slightly more into the soft soil, though no rainfall had fallen in the last hour. A faint sound reached his ears, a whisper, carried by the wind. Too faint to make out words, closer now, receding. A soft rustling from the underbrush ahead. He squinted. Nothing moved. Benjamin pressed on. The forest darkened rapidly as storm clouds gathered overhead. Leaves shook under raindrops, sending cold splashes across his cheeks. He came to a creek, swollen from rain, water rushing over rocks with a roar. He paused to step carefully across stepping stones slick with algae. One stone gave slightly underfoot. His heart skipped. He looked up. Across the creek, a figure crouched behind a thick cedar. Pale, shivering, too small to see clearly, but there was movement, subtle, deliberate. The figure ducked lower, just enough to disappear completely. Benjamin called out. There was no answer. He stepped forward. The forest seemed to respond. Branches bent slightly, brushing against him, though the wind had ceased. The fog thickened suddenly, cold against his skin. The creek sounded muted, as if it had slowed. A snapping of twigs behind him. Benjamin spun. Nothing. He turned back to where the figure had been. Nothing. Only a patch of disturbed soil, dark and wet, with a faint imprint, small, almost childlike. But it didn't resemble a human foot, too elongated, too symmetrical, too perfect. He stepped back, heart hammering. Something shifted in the corner of his eye, a movement too fast to track. A shadow darted between the trunks, circling him silently. He ran. Branches tore at his clothing, mud sprayed with every footfall. The forest seemed endless, the trail folding back on itself as though trying to trap him. Every familiar rock and tree suddenly looked alien, distorted by the fog. Another whisper closer this time. Not words, but a sound like a small, urgent exhale. He glanced toward it, and a flash of pale hair appeared between two trunks. Benjamin tripped, fell. The whisper stopped. Silence pressed in. When he scrambled upright, the figure was gone. No footprints, no trace, only the faint scent of wet earth and something else. Something faintly metallic. The storm worsened. Lightning flickered behind the thick canopy, illuminating twisted shapes in the distance. Every shadow seemed animate. Every rustle became a threat. By nightfall, searchers found Benjamin's backpack abandoned at the edge of a mossy slope. Inside were his map, a half-eaten granola bar, and his flashlight still on, beam pointing into the forest. His footprints disappeared halfway down the trail. The soft soil and leaf litter showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of passage beyond that point. Search dogs whinnied, refusing to cross the threshold of the dense trees. Rangers reported an oppressive weight in the air, heavy, cold, unrelenting, as if the forest itself was aware of them and waiting. Visitors to the trail in the following months said they sometimes glimpsed a pale figure moving just beyond the tree line in fog-heavy mornings. Some claimed to hear soft whispering carried on the Windaboy's voice calling, then abruptly stopping. No trace of Benjamin Gibbs was ever recovered. The trail remains open, yet those who walk it report unease, sensation of being observed, and footsteps that appear in the damp soil behind them always, stopping when they turn to look. The Olympic forest continues to breathe in silence, patient, eternal. Mount Rainier National Park. Washington, 2017. The disappearance of Andrew McCarthy. The mountain air was thin, sharp, carrying the scent of wet stone and alpine flowers. Mist rolled down the slopes in ghostly curtains, curling around the jagged ridges and pine-laden valleys. Andrew McCarthy hiked alone along the trail to Panorama Point, his boots crunching softly on gravel mixed with pine needles. Each step echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the wilderness. The sky was low and gray, clouds pressing against the peaks. A light drizzle coated the rocks, slicking surfaces that normally offered secure footing. The trail twisted sharply upward, steep and treacherous, lined with brambles and low-hanging branches that snagged its sleeves. Andrew paused at a bend overlooking a sheer drop. The fog clung to the edge of the cliff, curling over the void like smoke. He squinted to see the valley below. The clouds shifted, and for a moment, it appeared as though the forest stretched endlessly, dark and alive. A sudden snap twig underfoot. No, not his. Something shifted behind the tree line. He turned. Nothing. The mist seemed to swirl in the shape of a figure, tall and elongated, just beyond the last visible tree. He stepped forward, heart quickening. A soft wind stirred, brushing against his neck. He could hear the faintest sound of footfalls in the wet leaves behind him. He spun around. Nothing. The trail narrowed. Roots jutted from the soil, slick with rain. The sound of water running through nearby streams was steady but muffled, almost eerily calm. Andrew pressed on. A branch cracked sharply to his right. He froze, at hammering. Mist twisted in front of him, forming shapes that disappeared as soon as he blinked. He reached a plateau. Fog rolled in faster here, curling along the ground, obscuring the trail ahead. The rocks seemed to shift subtly, though he knew they were fixed. His eyes caught movement small, pale. A figure crouched behind a boulder. "Hello?" he called, voice quivering slightly. No answer. The figure moved just slightly and vanished behind the rock entirely. The forest returned to stillness. Andrew continued. The fog thickened. The trail he knew so well appeared wrong trees in places they hadn't been moments ago. The slope steeper, the rocks slicker. The air grew cold, wet, heavy. He heard whispers, soft and fleeting, voices too high to be human, barely audible over the patter of rain. He stopped to look back. The valley below was swallowed entirely by fog. No trail, no sign of hikers he had passed earlier, only endless gray and the muted roar of the forest. Sudden movement to his left, quick, fluid, impossible to trace. He spun, flashlight beam cutting weakly through the mist. The light fell on nothing but rocks and moss. He stepped forward cautiously. The mist seemed to rise from the ground itself, curling around his ankles, clinging to his boots. A sound soft tapping echoed from somewhere above. Rhythmic 5 taps. Andrew froze. The tapping stopped. The forest held its breath. Then a faint voice, childlike and high, whispered from nowhere in particular. "Come here!" He turned, shining his light in every direction. Nothing, only fog, bending and folding unnaturally. Another snap. Footsteps, not his own, but light, irregular, approaching from behind. He spun, still nothing. The trail widened briefly into a small clearing. Rocks glistened with rain, the earth disturbed as if someone or something had moved through recently. A patch of bare soil, compressed perfectly. No footprints. Just the impression of weight pressed into the earth. Andrew's heart raced. He called out again. Silence answered. He continued uphill. The fog thickened to nearly waist height. Shapes seemed to form within it, figures, crouching behind trunks, pale glimpses moving too fast to catch. Every time he looked, they disappeared, and a scream, high, distant, carried on the wind. Human? Not human? He could not tell. Andrew ran, slipping on the slick rocks. Branches tore at his clothing. The fog pressed around him like a living thing, bending his perception. He reached what he thought was the top of the ridge. Nothing. The trail had vanished. The rocks below seemed to drop away into nothing, black voids hidden by mist. Every tree looked identical. Ah! Every shadow was alive. He called out again. His voice was swallowed. A small, pale figure appeared on a nearby rock, tilted its head, watching, motionless. Then it leapt or vanished. He could not tell which. The next morning, search teams found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Only Andrew's pack, lying abandoned at the trailhead, damp with rain, still containing his water bottle and map. Helicopters scoured the slopes. Dogs sniffed every boulder and root. The forest swallowed all signs of him. Visitors weeks later reported faint whispers along the ridge, its footsteps circling among the trees and brief glimpses of a lone figure in the fog, then gone. Mount Rainier remains quiet, patient. Fog drifts through its forests, hiding paths, erasing tracks, and holding the lost in its cold embrace. Shenandoah National Park. Virginia, 2018. The disappearance of Caleb Lowe, the forest along the Appalachian Trail, was quiet. Deceptively so, as Caleb Lowe walked with his backpack snug against his shoulders. Mist hung low in the hollows, weaving through the tree trunks and coiling around the undergrowth like smoke. The smell of damp earth, moss, and decaying leaves was strong, almost cloying, carrying a metallic temps he couldn't identify. The trail twisted through the dense forest, rocky in places, with steep slopes on either side. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in pale streaks, highlighting patches of moss and wet pine needles. A small stream gurgled nearby, its steady, soft rush creating a rhythm that Caleb found oddly comforting. He paused to take a sip of water. Sudden rustle to his left caught his attention. Branches shifted, leaves trembling, but no wind stirred the canopy. Nothing visible moved, only a subtle displacement of shadows. He stepped forward. 10 feet. 20. The trail narrowed. Rocks jutted from the soil like broken teeth. Every step required care. One slip could send him tumbling down the slope. He felt at first as a weight of pressure in the air, a sensation that he was being watched from all directions at once. Goosebumps prickled along his arms. His heartbeat quickened. A sound came from behind him. Twigs snapping. Soft, irregular, almost cautious. He spun around. Nothing. The forest seemed off. Colors muted. Shadows unnaturally deep. The mist had thickened, curling at eye level. Shapes seemed to flit in the corners of his vision. Too quick, too fleeting to catch. Caleb pressed on. The trail descended sharply. Roots twisted across the path like veins. The air felt colder. Now the stream to his right grew louder, though its course had not changed. Occasionally, a rock would shift underfoot on its own, startling him. Then came the whisper, soft, almost inaudible. A child's voice, far off. "Help me." He froze. The mist pressed closer. The sound stopped abruptly, called out, voice cracking. Silence. A branch snapped near his left shoulder. He whipped around. Nothing. Shadows deepened. Shapes moved in ways that defied logic. Trees seemed to lean just slightly, repositioning themselves between steps. The air vibrated subtly, a low hum that resonated in his chest. Caleb noticed the trail itself was wrong. Familiar rocks were gone, the slope steeper. He glanced back, but the forest behind him had changed. Where there had been a gentle descent, now stood a wall of moss-covered roots and trunks. Panic rose. He ran. The mist thickened further. Footsteps echoed, though no one followed. He called out again. His voice felt swallowed by the forest, muffled and distant. A shadow appeared, a head figure crouched low between two trees. Pale, indistinct, barely visible through the fog. He froze, heart thudding. The figure moved, just slightly, then vanished. Caleb stumbled over roots and rocks, sliding into a shallow gully. Mud and water drenched his shoes. He scrambled to his feet. The trail disappeared entirely beneath dense brush and mist. Then came the sound, soft, irregular tapping, like fingernails on bark. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Caleb's skin prickled. He spun in a circle. Nothing. A whisper on the wind. Not words, just the sound of breath. Quick, short, deliberate. He ran blindly. Rocks scraped his legs, branches tore at his clothes. Rain made the soil slick. The forest seemed alive, reshaping itself around him, bending the trail, elongating shadows. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning. He reached a small clearing with a shallow pond. The water reflected the pale fog above. There on the edge of the reflection was a pale figure standing motionless, not moving toward him, not away. Simply standing, watching. Caleb called again. The figure tilted its head and vanished entirely. By the following morning, search teams found no footprints, no sign of struggle. Only his backpack, abandoned at the trailhead, containing water bottles, map, and snacks. No trace beyond that. Local hikers later reported strange occurrences on that trail. Soft whispers in the fog, glimpses of pale figures darting behind trees, and sudden cold patches in the mist that left goosebumps crawling across the skin. Footsteps often appeared in soft earth, sometimes following hikers, sometimes stopping abruptly when noticed. The forest remained patient, silent, reshaping itself. Caleb Lowe vanished into it completely, leaving only the fog, the trees, and the weight of unseen eyes. Glacier National Park, Montana 2016. The disappearance of Walker Ellis, the late afternoon sun slanted low across the jagged peaks of Glacier National Park, casting long shadows that stretched across rocky outcrops and pine-laden valleys. Walker Ellis moved cautiously along a steep trail near Avalanche Lake, boots crunching over loose gravel and frozen soil. The air smelled of wet stone, pine sap, and the faint tank of glacial runoff. Mist clung to the treetops, drifting down in thin fingers, curling over roots and rocks. The wind moved unevenly, sometimes still, sometimes gusting sharply, carrying the faint echo of water cascading down distant cliffs. Walker stopped briefly, adjusting the straps of his backpack. His eyes swept the valley below. Fog drifted across the lake in pale, ghostly wisps. Shapes moved just beyond the tree line, too quick, too fleeting to identify. The trail narrowed sharply. One misstep could send him sliding down the slope. He continued carefully, scanning the terrain. A snapping branch echoed behind him, soft, deliberate. He spun. Nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The fog thickened, hurling around the tree trunks and gathering an ankle level. He felt a pressure on his chest, subtle but unyielding, as though the very air was waiting. Footsteps echoed from the mist, though Walker was alone. They approached, then receded, unpredictable, he called out. His voice bounced weakly off the rocks and pines. The echoes returned, but distorted long, drawn out, almost mocking. He pressed on, heart pounding. Rocks underfoot shifted slightly, though he hadn't disturbed them. Moss seemed thicker. Roots protruded where they hadn't been before. The trail itself felt wrong. Then he saw it, a pale figure crouched behind a large boulder. Thin, small, still. Its head tilted slightly. Walker froze. The figure moved, just a flicker, and disappeared behind the rock entirely. The fog thickened suddenly, so dense it swallowed the trail completely. He stumbled forward, disoriented. Branches tore at his clothes, roots snagged his boots, and he tried to retrace his steps. Every familiar landmark had shifted, trees and boulders rearranged by some unseen hand. The sound came next, a soft tapping on stone, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, 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 pause, tap. Walker's blood ran cold. The tapping moved around him, circling, untraceable. He spun, flashlight beam sweeping through mist and shadows. No figure, no sign of life. A whisper floated on the wind, faint, high-pitched, almost imperceptible. He ran blindly. The trail disappeared entirely beneath fog and brush. Rocks and roots became hazards, but he could not stop. Every direction seemed infinite, twisting the forest in impossible ways. Suddenly, the mist parted just enough to reveal a shallow depression in the moss-covered earth. The ground looked pressed down as if someone had knelt there for a long time. But there were no footprints, no soil displacement from sliding. Only the impression of weight perfectly formed. Walker hesitated. He felt eyes on him all around, though nothing moved. The forest itself seemed alive, patient, waiting. He ran again, slipping over slick stones, branches snapping. Fog thickened, curling around him like living tendrils. He called out again, his voice fading, swallowed instantly. The night fell, cold, silent. The fog grew dense, the forest darker than natural. Wolves howled in the distance, but closer sounds, footsteps, whispers, tapping echoed unnaturally, sometimes behind, sometimes ahead. By morning, search teams arrived. Helicopters circled, dogs scoured the slope, rangers checked every nook. Nothing. No footprints, no belongings, no sign of Walker Ellis. Only the indentation in the moss remained chilled, undisturbed, as if untouched by human hands. Hikers in the area since report strange experiences. Pale figures glimpsed in fog, the soft tap-tap of fingernails on rock or roots, whispers in the wind. Footsteps that appear behind them, stopping when noticed. Shadows bending and shifting independently of the sun. Glacier National Park remained unchanged on the surface, calm and majestic. But the mist lingers in the valleys. The forest holds its breath, and the mountain continues to quietly claim those who wander too far, too deep, too curious. Walker Ellis was never found. The forest keeps him, patient, silent, waiting. Yellowstone National Park. Wyoming, 2019, the vanishing of Brian Laundrie. The sky above Yellowstone was a blanket of gray, dense with clouds, pregnant with rain. Steam rose from the geysers, curling in strange, ghostly spirals, twisting and vanishing before they reached the trees. The sulfurous smell of hot springs mingled with wet soil and pine resin, a combination that made the air heavy, almost acidic, in the back of the throat. Brian Laundrie hiked alone along the Fairy Falls Trail. His boots sank slightly into the damp soil with each step, crunching through fallen pine needles and scattered gravel. The forest seemed quiet, deceptively so, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Occasionally a distant bird called, but the echoes faded unnaturally fast, as though swallowed by the heavy air. He paused by a fallen log to adjust his pack, brushing water from his jacket. The mist clung to the trees in shifting coils, curling around gnarled roots and low branches, every now and then. It seemed to take shape-thin silhouettes in the periphery of his vision, but whenever he looked, there was nothing. The trail twisted upward, steep and slick from recent rainfall. Rocks glistened underfoot, moss coating them in neon green patches. The wind rose unexpectedly, rattling the trees and sending a cascade of needles and tiny branches down. Brian's heart jumped at the sudden noise, though it was almost imperceptible, like the forest had sighed around him. A faint sound came from behind him, snapping twigs, light but deliberate. He froze, his breath caught. The mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. He spun slowly. Nothing. The path widened briefly into a clearing near a hot spring. Steam rolled lazily above a pool, reflecting gray clouds. In the corner of his vision, Brian thought he saw a pale figure crouched just beyond the trees. He blinked. Gone, he called out. His voice echoed oddly, stretched in strange, wavering tones across the forest. It did not return to him as normal sound, but warped, distorted. Continuing cautiously, he noticed the forest shifting subtly. Familiar landmarks seemed to have moved. Rocks he remembered on his left were now to his right. A fallen tree that should have blocked the trail had vanished entirely. The air pressed heavier, colder, every breath felt dense. The mist thickened suddenly, curling around his ankles, then rising to knee height. Shapes formed within elongated shadows, flickering among the trees, appearing just long enough to spark fear before disappearing. The wind carried soft whispers, too distant, too fleeting to understand, but unmistakably human. A figure appeared on a ridge above him, pale, motionless, watching. Brian's stomach tightened. He took a cautious step forward. The figure vanished. The forest returned to stillness, but the weight in the air remained, pressing in on his chest. Hours passed. The trail became a labyrinth. Every direction appeared identical. Roots and rocks had shifted, trees bent subtly in impossible angles. Brian's sense of direction collapsed. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into a trap, the forest reshaping itself, stretching, bending, hiding him. He stumbled over a rock, cutting his hand. A trickle of blood soaked his sleeve. He glanced back. The path behind him no longer looked like the one he had taken. The clearing, the steam pool, even the hot spring itself seemed to have shifted. Then came the whisper again, this time close, almost beside him. Brian. He spun. Nothing, only fog curling like fingers around the trunks. A snapping of twigs behind him, rapid, approaching, then fading. Brian ran blindly. Branches tore at his clothing, roots snagged at his boots. The forest grew darker. Mist thickened to waist height. The trail he had been following had vanished completely, replaced by indistinguishable forest, rock, and fog. He tried to call for help. His voice was swallowed immediately, leaving nothing but the faintest echo. Shapes flitted in his peripheral vision too fast, too fleeting to catch. Small movements, pale glimpses, shadows that bent unnaturally. Hours or maybe minutes later, he came upon a shallow depression in moss-covered soil. The ground was pressed down as if someone or something had knelt there, but there were no footprints. No other signs of passage, just the cold impression in the earth, perfect and untouched. Exhausted, terrified, he pressed onward. Trees bent subtly toward him, branches brushing his face with precise intent, obstacles appearing suddenly. A pale figure appeared, a head small, crouched, motionless, watching. When he blinked, it vanished. The forest itself seemed alive, waiting, patient. The fog thickened, sound vanished. Tapping began soft, irregular, circling him. Tap, tap, pause, tap. By nightfall, searchers would later find only his backpack abandoned at the trailhead. Water bottles, map, snacks all untouched. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Only the forest remained, patient, silent, reshaping itself in the mist. Even years later, hikers report pale figures glimpsed in fog, soft whispering, carried by wind, footsteps following but stopping abruptly when looked at. Yellowstone holds its secrets, quietly absorbing those who wander too far. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado 2014, the disappearance of Abigail Smith. The early morning was cold, frost clinging to pine needles and jagged rocks. Abigail Smith hiked along a high ridge trail, the air crisp and thin, each breath sharp and audible. Snow lay in patches, wet and compact, cracking softly underfoot. The sun rose slowly, slanting pale light across the peaks, casting long shadows into the valleys. The trail twisted unpredictably, narrowing to a thin ribbon between cliffs and dense forest. Every sound echoed strangely: crunching snow, a distant bird call, even her own labored breath. Each echo seemed delayed, stretched, as if the mountains themselves were distorting sound. Suddenly, a gust of wind brought with it a low, eerie hum. Frost rattled from branches. Abigail paused, scanning the tree line. Shadows seemed thicker, shapes twisting in corners of her eyes, elongated, fluid, vanishing whenever looked at directly. She pressed on, heart quickening. The trail narrowed further, jagged rocks jutted from the earth. Roots snaked across it. Snow turned to slick ice in places. Her boots slipped. Each misstep brought her closer to the cliff's edge, yet the path behind her seemed wrong. Familiar rocks had moved. Trees, she remembered, were gone. The slope seemed steeper, narrower. Whispers rode the wind, soft, distant, high-pitched, impossible to locate. Abigail ran. Her breath came fast, heart hammering. The forest seemed alive, bending and reshaping itself around her. Shadows elongated unnaturally. Mist rolled down from higher peaks, thickening, swirling around her legs like ghostly fingers. Then she glimpsed it. A pale figure crouched behind a boulder, motionless, observing. She froze, blinked, gone. The wind carried soft laughter, faint but distinct, echoing off cliffs. Branches cracked around her, though no animal nor human was visible. She stumbled on a hidden route, falling hard, mud and snow soaking her gloves. Hours passed, or minutes. Time lost meaning. Every direction appeared identical. Trees, boulders, mist repeating endlessly. She called for help. Voice was swallowed, stretched, distorted by the mountains. Eventually, searchers found a scarf snagged on a branch, a boot print frozen in snow, but nothing beyond. The trail itself seemed altered, reshaped by the forest, erasing Abigail completely. Locals whisper of hikers seeing pale figures in the mist, hearing faint whispers, footsteps behind them but disappearing when turned toward. Everglades National Park. Florida 2011, the disappearance of Daniel Freeman. The Everglades were a suffocating, humid labyrinth of mangroves, shallow waterways, and endless swamp. Daniel Freeman moved cautiously, boots sinking into thick mud, each step sending small fish scattering in the murky water. The air was heavy with humidity, stagnant yet alive with insects, the constant hum of mosquitoes and distant croaks of unseen creatures. Sunlight filtered weakly through thick canopy, casting everything in a green-gold haze. Twisting roots and low branches caught at his clothes, snagging sleeves and pant legs. The waterlogged ground slowed him, each step a small battle. He paused, shape-shifted in the mist of pale flash, too fast to identify. The forest seemed alive, aware, listening. A soft whisper drifted on the wind, faint, almost imperceptible. Here, Daniel pressed on, deeper into the mangroves. The water rose slightly, mud pulling at his boots. Birds and frogs were silent. Only the faintest rustle behind him made him turn. Nothing. He reached a small clearing, shallow pond reflecting a broken greenish sky. A pale figure crouched at the edge. Not moving, not approaching. He blinked. Gone. Twilight fell. The forest thickened, night predators unseen, air heavy and cold against his skin. Whispering carried across water channels. Small shapes flickered in the mist, darting between roots and trunks. Search teams found only a hat floating in shallow water. No footprints beyond, no disturbed vegetation, no signs of struggle. The swamp reclaimed everything. Visitors report pale figures glimpsed in fog, faint footsteps circling. The hum of whispered voices in the Everglades' oppressive heat. Grand Teton National Park. Wyoming 2013, the disappearance of Marissa Clark. The dawn light slanted across jagged peaks, long shadows stretching into deep valleys. Marissa Clark hiked along the Snake River Trail, frost sparkling on rocks, dew soaking her boots. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of cold water, wet pine, and damp soil. The forest seemed alive. Every sound was echoed strangely, stretched unnaturally. Branches snapped in the distance, though no wind stirred. Mist curled at eye level, thick, twisting, obscuring the path. Marissa paused near a log. The hairs on her arms rose. Branches cracked behind her. Shadows moved unnaturally. Pale figures crouched behind boulders, motionless, watching. Blink. Gone. The trail narrowed. The river roared faintly below. Rocks glistened with frost. Roots tangled. Mist thickened, bending the light. Every step felt heavier. She ran. The forest reshaped itself around her. Familiar landmarks vanished. Whispered voices floated, distorted, unintelligible. Shapes flickered in the mist, small, pale, crouching, disappearing when noticed. Searchers found only a boot print near a frost-covered boulder, ending abruptly. Nothing else. The trail remained open, yet hikers report soft whispering, fleeting shadows, footsteps following but stopping when turned toward. How the Tetons held Marissa quietly, patiently, as if she had simply been absorbed into the mist and forest itself. Olympic National Park, Washington, 2016. The disappearance of Walker Ellis the morning was heavy with mist. Fog rolled in from the Olympic Peninsula, curling like living fingers around moss-draped tree trunks. Every branch glistened with water and droplets hung from needles, quivering with the faintest movement. The air smelled of wet soil, decaying leaves, and the faint metallic temps of minerals carried down from high ridges. Walker Ellis tightened the straps on his backpack, boots sinking slightly into the saturated trail, each step making a soft squelch. The Hoh rainforest stretched infinitely ahead. Towering evergreens created a dense canopy that filtered pale light in thin greenish beams. Shadows seemed darker here, almost solid, clinging to the mossy undergrowth. The forest was alive, but silent, every rustle, every drip, magnified in the humid stillness. He could hear the distant murmur of the Hoh River, its waters rushing over rocks. But every other sound seemed muted, swallowed by the dense fog. As Walker moved forward, he noticed the first anomaly. A branch cracked behind him light, sharp but there was no wind. The mist swirled unnaturally around his legs. He spun, flashlight trembling in hand, but saw nothing, only fog curling against the mossy ground. Every time he blinked, the forest seemed slightly different. Tracks shifted. Roots protruded where they hadn't been moments ago. Fallen logs appeared, or vanished. The trail narrowed suddenly. Roots twisted like veins across the path, slick with rainwater, as the air grew heavier, thick, pressing against his chest. Every step forward felt like pushing against an unseen weight. He could hear his own heart beat loud in his ears. He swallowed hard and pressed on. The snapping of twigs echoed from the left. He froze. His breath came shallow. His eyes darted to the undergrowth, shifted, forming shapes at the corner of his vision. Elongated, pale, crouching, but gone when he turned to look directly. The whispers began, faint, high-pitched, unintelligible at first, as if the forest itself were speaking in tongues he could almost comprehend. Walker increased his pace, trying to keep the trail in sight. Every familiar landmark seemed warped. Trees he recognized from the trailhead were now twisted, their bark mottled with shadows that did not match their branches. The fog thickened to waist height, curling over roots and rocks like fingers attempting to grasp him. The low hum of the forest vibrated in his chest. He came to a small clearing. The moss-covered ground pressed unnaturally under his boots, as if bearing the weight of someone kneeling, yet no footprints marked the soil. A pale figure crouched at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Its head tilted slightly, observing him. He blinked in. It was gone. The whispers grew louder, closer, circling him, carrying the faintest hints of words. Walker. Come. He stumbled, tripping over a root hidden beneath the moss, landing hard on his shoulder. Pain shot through his arm, but fear drove him upright immediately. The forest had grown impossibly dark for mid-morning, shadows curling and twisting in impossible angles. Branches snapped and rustled violently behind him. He ran blindly, boots slipping in mud, roots tearing at his clothes. Every direction looked identical trees, rocks, mist, all repeating infinitely. Damn. Every time he glanced back, pale figures appeared at the corner of his vision, crouched, then vanishing when fully observed. Arzor, perhaps minutes passed. Time seemed suspended. Walker felt dizzy, disoriented. The forest had reshaped itself, creating a labyrinth of impossible trails. Mist thickened to chest height. Shapes moved around him, circling, stalking, but never fully visible. The whispers persisted, high-pitched, urgent, unintelligible, yet chillingly familiar. He collapsed at one point on a moss-covered boulder, chest heaving. The forest was silent, then a soft, rapid tapping started on nearby roots. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The sound moved unpredictably, circling him. He could see faint shadows flitting through the fog. He scrambled to his feet, every muscle aching. The trail seemed endless. Trees bent subtly toward him, branches brushing his face deliberately. Rocks shifted beneath his feet. A faint figure appeared ahead, crouched motionless on a fallen log. He blinked, it vanished instantly. By dusk, exhaustion overtook him. The forest pressed closer. Mist crawled along the ground like sentient water. Walker called out, voice cracking. The echo returned, distorted, stretched in an unnatural way, warped by the dense trees and fog. By morning, searchers found only his backpack near the trailhead. Boots, water bottles, map untouched. No footprints beyond that point. Dogs refused to enter the mist-heavy section of trail. Rangers reported a low, oppressive pressure in the air. The forest itself seemed to watch, patient and eternal. Hikers now report glimpses of pale figures crouched just beyond the trees. Footsteps in wet moss that stop when looked at directly, and whispers that follow through the fog. Olympic National Park keeps its loss quietly, patiently, indefinitely. Walker Ellis vanished completely, absorbed by mist and forest alike. Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona 2015. The disappearance of Emily Hart. The sun hung low over the Grand Canyon, slanting red-orange light across jagged cliffs, casting immense shadows into the valley below. Emily Hart hiked the South Kaibab Trail alone, boots stirring dust and loose gravel. The air was dry, carrying the faint scent of juniper and heated stone, making her throat scratchy with each breath. The canyon was eerily silent. Normally, distant birds and hikers' voices would echo, but now there was only wind, sometimes howling through narrow crevices, sometimes completely absent. Every footstep she took sounded deafening. A shadow moved below her on a ledge pale, crouched, impossible to identify from this distance. When she squinted, it vanished. The cliffs themselves seemed alive. Rocks that had appeared stable shifted subtly under her eyes. The slope she had carefully navigated minutes ago now seemed steeper, more treacherous. She tried to trace her path backward. Nothing looked familiar. A sudden snap of rock above her. Her heart jumped, and a faint whisper, carried by wind, high-pitched Emily. She called out. But her voice was absorbed by the canyon walls, returned to her as a distorted echo that chilled her blood. She pressed onward, adrenaline surging. Dust and pebbles tumbled down cliffs beside her. Shapes flickered at the edges of her vision, crouched just beyond sight. Pale figures appeared and vanished instantly, leaving the landscape undisturbed. The trail became a labyrinth. Sunlight dimmed as clouds thickened overhead. Every turn seemed to fold back upon itself. Mist rose suddenly from the canyon floor, swirling around her ankles, twisting and climbing like living tendrils. By twilight, she stumbled to a ledge overlooking a small creek below. Her flashlight fell on a pale figure crouched motionless among rocks. She blinked, it was gone. Shadows in the canyon now stretched unnaturally, moving independently of any source of light. Arzor perhaps mere minutes passed. Emily's voice faltered in the endless echo of cliffs and mist. The trail disappeared entirely into fog. Rocks, boulders, and trees shifted subtly underfoot. Every step felt like moving deeper into a trap, the canyon itself reshaping her path. Search teams later found her water bottle near the rim. Footprints ended abruptly in loose gravel. No other signs. Hikers since report ghostly figures along the South Kaibab. Whispers in the wind and sudden drops in temperature as if unseen eyes are watching. The Grand Canyon absorbed her completely, leaving only dust, echoes, and shadow. Sequoia National Park, California, 2018. The disappearance of Michael Rhodes' fog rolled through the towering sequoias, twisting around trunks that seemed impossibly tall, ancient, alive. Michael Rhodes hiked along a narrow trail, the ground damp with moss and fallen pine needles. The smell of sap, wet wood, and decaying leaves hung thick in the air. Branches cracked behind him. Shadows shifted at the corner of his visional, elongated, pale, crouch, but vanished when he looked directly. The trail twisted sharply, roots and rocks creating obstacles with each step. The forest seemed to breathe, waiting, watching. Mist thickened to ankle level, curling around his legs, then rising to knees. The towering sequoias blocked light, turning the forest dim, even at midday. A soft whisper floated on the wind, unintelligible, urgent. He increased his pace. Rocks shifted beneath his boots. Roots snagged his clothes. The forest subtly reshaped itself around him. Landmarks he remembered were now in impossible places. A faint figure crouched on a fallen log, pale and motionless. Blink it vanished. He stumbled into a dense thicket. Mist clung to his jacket, dripped from his hair. Branches tore at his arms. Every sound footsteps. Snapping twigs echoed unnaturally, making it impossible to discern direction. Night fell quickly beneath the dense canopy. Shadows lengthened and stretched in impossible angles. Whispering grew louder, surrounding him. Shapes flitted in the mist, small, crouched, darting between trunks. Searchers later found only a jacket snagged on a branch, footprints ending abruptly in wet soil. Hikers report fleeting pale figures, whispers that circle and fade, and branches moving as if pushed by unseen hands. The sequoias keep their loss quietly, endlessly patient. Michael Rhodes vanished entirely. The roaring river morning fog clung to the roaring river and thinned. Drifting ribbons, weaving between boulders slick with dew. The water roared louder than the early campers expected. Swollen from days of July storms that had cut fresh grooves through the riverbed, the forest around it breathed quiet and deep. High in the pines, the first sunlight caught on wet needles, scattering cold drops to the forest floor in slow, rhythmic taps. Damp earth darkened the toes of small boots moving near the riverbank, their tread biting shallowly into mud softened by the night's rainfall. The tracks wove back and forth in erratic loops, never straying too far from the water's edge, then veering toward a line of trees clustered tightly together. Pine needles blanketed the ground beyond this point, erasing all sign of where the feet had gone next. In the camp nearby, canvas tents shifted softly in the light breeze. Smoke curled upward from a few breakfast fires, drifting lazily into the air before the breeze carried it downslope. Metal coffee pots clinked faintly. Distant voices carried an uneven burst, scare-free, unaware, and softened by the dense forest. But deeper, among the trees past, the reach of campsite chatter. Past where sunlight properly touched the ground, the forest held its breath. Boulders covered in thick green moss lined the slope above the river. They glistened faintly beneath the dull morning glow. Between them, shadows pooled in angles that should not have allowed such darkness, pockets of lightlessness that seemed to drag the mist toward themselves. A thin trail of pine needles shifted, though there was no wind. A small form moved between trunks, pausing to touch the rough bark before stepping lightly over a fallen branch. The forest accepted the new presence with an eerie stillness. No birdsong rose, no insects clicked. Even the distant hum of the river seemed muted the moment the figure passed into the denser part of the woods. The trees thickened. Trunks grew so close together that light filtered through in thin, sharp blades, slicing briefer patterns across the forest floor with every breath of wind above. In these narrow bands of light, dust particles floated like suspended stars, each movement slow, deliberate, drifting within beams too narrow to fully reveal the space between. The small figure moved deeper.
A needle shifted softly underfoot.
A patch of sunlight caught on the back of a white cotton shirt before the child stepped into shadow again, disappearing almost instantly into darkness. Up on the slope, roots of ancient pines twisted like thick veins across the ground, gripping boulders and earth tightly. Mist rolled slowly along the base of these roots in thin, snaking tendrils, curling and uncurling around them like living threads. The movement was subtle, slow, controlled, as though the fog responded not to wind, but to something deeper within the forest floor. Further ahead, higher elevation brought cooler air. The scent of wet limestone seeped from crevices in the rock. A large fallen tree blocked part of the slope. Its trunk was hollowed in the middle. charred faintly at one end from an old lightning strike. Moss grew thickly around the blackened wood, dripping with moisture. Inside the hollow, something had nested recently. Pine needles arranged in a curvature, smoothed down by pressure, as though a small body had squeezed inside seeking shelter. The child's boot prints reappeared on the faint rise above the hollow, pressed lightly into a patch of softer soil. They pointed toward a narrow gap between two enormous boulders leaned together at a natural angle. The opening was darker than the forest behind it, wide enough for a small body to slip through, but too narrow for most adults. Thin threads of mist curled into the opening and vanished, consumed by the darkness beyond. A low humming vibration rippled through the stones, not loud, not sharp, but a deep, resonant pulse that traveled through the ground rather than the air. My needles shifted. Moss shivered. The mist drew inward as though inhaled. Inside the gap, the ground sloped gently downward. The air cooled sharply, carrying the scent of damp mineral and aged wood. A faint trickle of water echoed somewhere deeper in the space. Soft footsteps moved through the narrow channel, pausing occasionally as if listening. The light dimmed until only the faintest gray glow remained, reflecting off the moss-covered stone walls. Back at the river, a gust of wind suddenly stirred the treetops, sending loose needles fluttering down like rain. Birds erupted briefly in startled calls before falling silent once more. The forest seemed to shift in tone not visibly, but in an intangible pull, as though attention redirected toward the deeper interior where something had just changed. Beyond the narrow stone passage, the forest opened abruptly into a small, secluded glade. Sunlight from above filtered through in a strange, fractured patchwork. The canopy overhead was tight, but the center of the glade held a ring of light where branches parted unnaturally, as though pried back by unseen hands. The grass in this clearing grew shorter, as if pressed down repeatedly by bodies resting or moving across it. The earth smelled of crushed vegetation and minerals pulled from deeper layers. A thin stream cut through the clearing, shallow and clear. Pebbles lined its floor, each stone worn smooth by centuries of runoff. The water barely made a sound as it passed between rocks, flowing too gently for the force of the river nearby. It was oddly still for a mountain stream too still. The child's footprints appeared at the water's edge, lightly pressed, but perfectly formed. They continued along the bank, moving parallel to the clearing, tiny toes angling outward, as if the child hesitated at the cold touch of the water. The prints then curved suddenly toward the opposite side of the glade, where dense undergrowth formed a wall of green. Something stirred there, not an animal, not the wind. The underbrush shifted outward, as though something inside exhaled. Mist poured from the gap between two thick bushes, flowing downward like a waterfall of vapor. The grass in front of the gap turned darker, wet with moisture that hadn't been present moments earlier. The footprints ended at the edge of this shadowed passageway, not continued, not turned back, not scattered, ended, without a trace of disturbance beyond. Something deep within the darkness shifted again. A ripple, slow, deliberate movement, then silence. Above the clearing, a crow landed on a branch, feathers puffed against the cold. It tilted its head downward, as if following a sound no human ear could catch. For a moment, its gaze fixed on the gap in the underbrush. Then its wings snapped open. It launched into the air, cawing once loudly, urgently before disappearing into the treetops. The clearing fell still again. The mist at the edge of the gap thinned slowly before fading entirely, leaving the air cool, damp, and undisturbed. But beneath the soil, faint tremors continued soft pulses, spreading outward through roots and stone, echoing the shape of tiny footsteps that had moved where they should not have been able to go. Into the shadows, the morning mist had begun to thin along the edges of the glade. But inside the narrow channel where the child had disappeared, the air remained damp, heavy, and nearly still. Sunlight filtered only in slender shafts, creating elongated rectangles of pale light that stretched across the moss-covered stones. Every footfall echoed softly against rock walls, distorted by the narrow confines, giving the sense of a space larger than it truly was. The ground sloped downward, uneven, and littered with loose stones and pine needles. Each step pressed the soles of small boots against slick surfaces, requiring careful balance. Tiny rivulets of water trickled along the cracks in the stone, pooling here and there before vanishing into the earth. The channel itself twisted, curving unpredictably, forcing the traveler to pivot sharply around outcroppings of granite. Above, branches pressed against the crevices of the channel, their needles dripping condensation. The air was pungent with the scent of wet pine and soil disturbed only hours ago. Occasionally, the mist thickened into veils, partially obscuring vision, making it impossible to know what lay just beyond a bend. Shapes appeared at the periphery of sight, elongated, shifting, but when focus settled, they vanished as if they had never been. A soft, rhythmic vibration pulsed through the stones. It was not the river, not the wind, not the footfall of the child. It originated somewhere deeper in the channel, under layers of rock and soil. The pulse was subtle, like a heartbeat of the earth itself, slow and persistent, rising and falling in time with something unseen. The child's small boots pressed onward, moving deliberately, though the path offered no clear destination. Moss clung to ankles and fingertips as the figure grasped tree roots and stone ledges for support. Occasionally, droplets fell from the ceiling above, hitting the top of the head with cold precision. Further along, the channel widened slightly, opening into a shallow basin where water collected in a crystalline pool. Stones lined its edges, slick with moisture. A faint reflection appeared on the surface, pale and small. But the shape dissolved into the water's ripples before it could be distinguished. Mist rose from the pool, curling in slow spirals toward the ceiling of the cavern, mingling with drifting light to create the illusion of movement far larger than the figure moving along its edges. The channel narrowed again, forcing the traveler to stoop beneath a jagged overhang of stone. Fingers pressed against rough granite for balance, toes searching for traction in patches of slippery moss. The air smelled faintly of minerals and decay, a combination both pungent and metallic. Water dripped from the overhang, occasionally striking the top of a head, startling with its sudden coldness. At the far side of this narrow stretch, the channel opened into a triangular chamber, where boulders leaned together at unnatural angles. Mist pooled on the floor, curling upward as though breathing. Sunlight pierced the entrance in jagged lines, but beyond those slivers, shadows ran deep in uniform, masking every detail. Tiny footprints appeared in the mist, lightly pressed, showing a path from one side of the chamber to another. Each step was careful, deliberate, measured. Sometimes the footprints appeared to pause as if the child had hesitated or turned, but no disturbance of surrounding moss suggested anything beyond movement. At the chamber's center, a small patch of earth looked pressed, as though weight had been repeatedly applied. Moss was flattened, pine needles broken, and rearranged into faint arcs, concentric in their formation. A faint trace of something darker moisture, perhaps. Where soil overturned dribbled outward from the center, blending back into the natural pattern. The pulse in the ground continued, slow and deliberate, faint but unceasing. It seemed to guide the traveler deeper, through corridors that twisted unpredictably, forcing turns around sharp boulders, narrow gaps, and steep inclines. Light grew more distorted here, filtered through dense pine trunks, or absorbed entirely by the mist. Shapes flitted at the edges of perception, always crouched, always pale, never fully revealed, vanishing when observed directly. The air grew colder. Moisture clung to skin and clothing, chilling through fabric. Every step forward felt heavier, as though the channel itself resisted the journey. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting in ways the brain could not reconcile with physical reality. The river beyond could be heard faintly, distant and muffled, like a memory of sound, never close enough to reach. Occasionally a bird would cry, piercing the silence with a brief note, then all sound would vanish again. The mist seemed to carry whispers, not in human language, but in tones soft, urgent, pressing, vibrating through the ground beneath the soles of boots. At the far end of the chamber, a narrow slit of rock opened into a higher passage. The child climbed carefully, fingers pressed against rough stone, boots digging into moss and gravel. Each movement produced a faint scrape, barely audible over the pulse of the stones beneath. Mist rose to knee level, curling around legs, brushing fingertips as the climb continued. When the passage ended, the chamber opened into another shallow glade, this one ringed by ancient pines, whose roots twisted and burrowed into the earth like massive serpents. Sunlight filtered through gaps high above, striking the forest floor in thin, elongated beams. Mist hung low, obscuring details of the ground and turning every step into an exercise in careful observation. The small footprints continued across the clearing, pressed lightly into the damp moss. The pulse beneath the earth persisted, synchronized with the movement of tiny feet. Shapes moved at the periphery, crouched, pale but vanished instantly when directly observed. The forest seemed to shift subtly, rearranging itself, ensuring that no path could be traced backward. No landmarks remained familiar. The child paused at the edge of a shallow stream that had formed from recent rains. Pebbles underfoot were slick, water clear, but the surface reflected shapes that did not belong, shadows stretching beyond the bank, bending in impossible angles. Mist curled up from the water, coiling into spirals that moved almost consciously, drifting upward to dissolve into the canopy above. The footprints ended abruptly at the bank. Moss, pine needles, and wet soil showed no sign of passage beyond. Nothing disturbed, nothing left behind except the faint echo of movement and the pulse of the earth beneath. The forest remained perfectly still. What? The river murmured far below. Mist lingered in curls around the edges of the clearing, and somewhere deeper in the woods. The presence that had guided the child onward continued to wait, patient, silent, infinite. The forest labyrinth beyond the stream, the forest thickened suddenly. The small clearing ended, giving way to an impossibly dense cluster of pines whose trunks rose straight and unyielding. Spaced so tightly that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Mist hung low, snaking along roots and creeping over mossy rocks like living threads. Every step pressed the soles of boots into wet earth, soft and treacherous. The small figure moved cautiously, toes brushing against jagged roots that curled over the ground. Tiny hands grasped musk-covered bark for balance as the trail twisted unpredictably. The forest seemed alive here, breathing, waiting, shifting ever so slightly, as if reacting to each movement. Shapes lurked at the periphery, crouched, pale, glimpsed for an instant before vanishing. Branches snapped behind in faint succession. The sound was close, deliberate, but every turn revealed only the undisturbed forest. Mist swirled unnaturally around trunks, forming coils that clung to the small boots as if trying to halt forward motion. The pulse beneath the soil continued soft, deep, rhythmic, vibrating up through stone, moss, and roots. A fallen tree blocked the path, its surface slick with rain and decay. The child climbed over it carefully, hands pressing into wet bark, boots testing each foothold before committing weight. Moss and small plants tore beneath fingertips and knees, dropping fragments into the soft dirt below. The pulse continued, guiding onward, drawing the traveler deeper into the maze. The slope rose sharply, forcing careful navigation. Loose stones shifted slightly underfoot, creating faint echoes. Mist thickened as the forest floor tilted, curling upward over each root and boulder. Every breath drew in the scent of wet pine, decaying leaves, and earth disturbed only moments ago. Small droplets of condensation slid from branches, striking skin with cold precision. Through narrow gaps between trunks, faint light filtered in shards, revealing irregularities in the forest floor. Moss formed mounds and ridges, concealing depressions, shallow pits, and shallow water-filled hollows. Each step required attention. One misstep could send a small body tumbling into damp stone or twisted roots. A low, resonant hum traveled through the stones here, deep enough to vibrate through the soles of boots. It was steady, insistent, almost purposeful. Moss quivered in response. Roots shifted slightly as if breathing along with the pulse. Every movement was measured, deliberate. The forest seemed aware of the passage, cataloging each step. The path twisted again, taking the traveler along a narrow corridor formed by two massive boulders. Between them, space narrowed to barely a meter. Mist curled thickly here, concealing the floor, making each step uncertain. Tiny feet pressed lightly into damp moss, leaving faint impressions. Shapes flitted in peripheral vision, crouched pale, hovering at the edges, but disappeared instantly when focus turned. At the corridor's end, the ground leveled into another shallow glade. This one was smaller than the last, circular, ringed with thick roots and trunks that leaned slightly inward. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the canopy and fractured beams, illuminating the floor in shifting, irregular patterns. Moss and pine needles covered nearly everything. The footprints continued, pressed lightly, faint but unbroken. In the center of this glade, a patch of earth looked disturbed. Moss was flattened, pine needles arranged in arcs, concentric and meticulous. A thin layer of mist pooled low along the edges. The pulse beneath the ground was stronger here, resonating up through roots and stones. It seemed almost to mark the center, the heart of some hidden space. The child's small boots approached the edge of a shallow ditch filled with water. The stream that cut through the glade was slow, almost imperceptibly moving. Pebbles lined the bottom, smooth, shining faintly beneath the filtered light. Tiny ripples reflected shapes that didn't belong, shadows bending oddly across the water. Mist rose slowly, curling into spirals that stretched toward the overhanging branches. Beyond the stream, the forest became denser again, walls of trunks narrowing, bending inward. Light dwindled, as if the canopy itself thickened deliberately. The air was cooler, more humid. Condensation dripped from leaves and branches above. Faint metallic scent mingled with wet pine and soil. The pulse underfoot persisted. Every step was measured, careful, as the ground tilted and shifted unpredictably. Roots and stones created obstacles, moss concealed pits, and the trail twisted in ways impossible to map. The forest rearranged itself subtly, ensuring no path backward could be discerned. Crouched shapes remained at the edge of vision, pale, unmoving, just beyond the threshold of perception. They did not approach, did not flee. They waited, flickering between observation and disappearance, as if measuring the small traveler. The child crossed another shallow incline, boots pressing into soft moss, slipping slightly on wet rock, catching balance with fingertips against rough bark. Mist swirled around ankles and knees. The pulse resonated through every contact with the earth, vibrating beneath skin, bones, and muscles, urging forward. At the far edge of this glade, a natural corridor appeared formed by two leaning boulders and dense root walls. Mist hugged the edges, curling like living fingers. Tiny footprints pressed lightly into the damp moss, heading into the corridor, continuing the journey deeper. The forest around shifted. Light changed subtly, shadows deepened. Branches that had seemed still now swayed slightly, brushing the mist. Shapes crouched at the edges flickered more distinctly, just perceptible, pale, motionless, watching. Vanishing when observed, the child moved onward. Each step echoed softly in the stone and earth beneath. Mist drifted, curling upward from hidden cracks, snaking along roots and trunks. The pulse of the earth continued, deep, insistent, guiding the way. The trail twisted, narrowed, and bent unpredictably, leading ever deeper into the hidden heart of the forest. At the end of this narrow stretch, the forest opened into a shallow basin ringed by towering pines. Sunlight filtered through high branches and jagged beams. Mist clung to the edges, obscuring much of the floor. Pebbles glistened in shallow puddles. Moss glowed faintly, and the pulse beneath remained steady, insistent, infinite. The footprints continued, pressed lightly, faint but complete. Moss and soil showed no other disturbance. The forest held its breath, waiting, patient, eternal, the hidden hollow. The shallow basin of the glade stretched ahead, its floor uneven, with moss-covered stones and patches of soft earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in irregular shafts, illuminating glints of moisture clinging to the needles above. Mist lingered low, curling and twisting as though pulled by unseen currents. The small boots pressed into the soft ground, moving carefully across slick moss and loose debris. Roots twisted over the surface in thick, gnarled patterns, making each step a test of balance. Occasionally, tiny stones shifted underfoot, scraping softly against the moss and echoing faintly in the still air. The pulse beneath the earth continued steady, rhythmic, deep like the heart of some immense creature hidden beneath the forest floor. The glade narrowed slightly, forcing movement toward the left, where a natural slope rose gently to a dense line of pines. Mist thickened in this section, swirling over the soles of boots, clinging to ankles, and rising slowly up the calves. Faint shadows flickered at the edges of perception, crouched, pale, motionless. Whenever the traveler tried to focus, they vanished, leaving only the faintest distortion in the mist. A fallen branch lay across the path, slick with moisture. Tiny fingers gripped the rough bark as the body scrambled over, toes testing the moss for purchase. Droplets of condensation fell from overhead needles, striking the skin with cold precision. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if the path itself resisted movement. Beyond the branch, the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. The walls were lined with moss-covered rocks, uneven and treacherous. The mist pooled thicker here, curling over edges and into small depressions, masking shallow puddles and hidden roots. The pulse beneath the soil intensified slightly, vibrating through stone and moss alike. Small boots pressed onward, moving along the hollow's curve. Every step seemed measured against some invisible rhythm. Shapes flitted at the edge of vision, crouched, pale, watching, vanishing when observed. The forest seemed to shift subtly with each movement, rearranging itself, ensuring no clear path back. The hollow widened into another shallow clearing, irregular in shape. Sunlight pierced through the canopy in jagged, fragmented beams, creating shifting rectangles of light on the mossy floor. Pebbles and twigs glistened faintly with moisture. A shallow trickle of water ran across the center, barely audible over the distant roar of the roaring river. The pulse beneath continued, steady, insistent. Tiny footsteps pressed into the moss, moving toward the edge of the clearing. Shapes flitted in the mist, crouched and pale, appearing and disappearing like ghosts of the forest. The air was thick, heavy, smelling faintly of wet stone, pine, and earth disturbed recently. At the far side of the clearing, a natural corridor of trees and boulders opened, dark and narrow. The mist clung to its edges, curling like living fingers into the shaded interior. The small boots pressed into the moss, moving cautiously. Each step echoed faintly in the narrow space, distorted by the stones and roots. The corridor twisted sharply, forcing the traveler to pivot and crouch. Discovered roots pressed against knees and palms. The pulse beneath remained strong, insistent, vibrating through every contact with the ground. Shapes at the edges of perception crouched closer, watching, yet never approaching. A small trickle of water crossed the path, forming a shallow channel over smooth stones. Tiny toes pressed lightly into the wet surface, careful not to slip. The mist rose around ankles, curling upward as if inhaling with every step. Light filtered in faint shafts from above, illuminating brief glimpses of mossy walls and scattered pine needles. The corridor narrowed further, forcing movement into a near crawl. Hands and feet pressed against moss, stone, and roots for support. The pulse beneath continued, vibrating in synchrony with each movement. Shapes crouched at the edges flitted briefly, vanishing instantly when looked at directly. At the end of the corridor, the path opened into a shallow depression, surrounded by ancient pines. Moss covered nearly every inch of the floor, glistening with moisture. Sunlight pierced through tiny gaps high in the canopy, creating thin, irregular beams across the soft ground. Mist lingered, coiling around roots and stones, moving as though alive. Footprints continued across the depression, pressed lightly into the moss. Each step was careful, deliberate, faint but unbroken. The pulse beneath remained deep and steady, vibrating up through every stone, root, and patch of moss. Shadows moved at the periphery, crouched, pale, flickering in and out, but never approached. A small stream cut through the far edge of the depression, shallow and clear. Pebbles lined its bed, smooth and glistening. Water moved almost imperceptibly, carrying reflections of shapes that did not belong, shadows bending unnaturally across the surface. Mist rose slowly from the stream, curling upward in fine spirals. The footprints ended abruptly at the stream's edge. Moss and soil showed no sign of further passage. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, except the pulse of the earth beneath and the faint ripples of mist curling around roots and stones. The forest waited. The glade was still, silent, holding its breath. Light fell in fractured beams. Mist drifted in thin ribbons. And somewhere beneath, deep in the soil, the pulse continued, steady, infinite, patient. The whispering trees. Beyond the shallow depression, the forest narrowed again. Ancient pines pressed closely together, their thick trunks forming near impenetrable walls. Light filtered only in thin shards, barely illuminating the mossy floor beneath. Mist clung low, curling in serpentine ribbons along roots and stones, rising toward ankles, knees, and then dissipating into the shadows. The child's small boots pressed cautiously into the soft moss. Fingers trailed along rough bark to maintain balance. Tiny twigs snapped softly underfoot, echoing faintly in the stillness. The pulse beneath the earth continued, steady, insistent, vibrating through stones, roots, and moss alike. Shapes flitted at the periphery of vision, crouched, pale, impossible to focus on. Each movement dissolved them into the mist, leaving only subtle distortions in the air and the faintest shadows cast on tree trunks. The forest seemed aware of the passage, reshaping itself subtly to ensure no clear path backward. No familiar landmark remained. A low, resonant hum reverberated through the stone below the soil, synchronized with the pulse. It resonated faintly through every contact with the forest floor. Moss quivered slightly. Loose stones shifted. Roots trembled under pressure. The sensation was not threatening, but deliberate, guiding, almost mechanical in its precision. A fallen log blocked the path ahead. Moss slicked its surface, wet from condensation, dripping steadily from the canopy above. Tiny hands grasped the bark for support while toes tested the mossy surface. Droplets fell from above, cold, sharp. Each step required careful attention, deliberate precision, a rhythm maintained in tune with the pulse beneath. Beyond the log, the path rose gradually. Pebbles shifted under pressure, small rivulets of water flowed through depressions in the soil. Moss grew thicker on exposed roots, curling around the base of tree trunks like fingers reaching for the traveler. The mist thickened here, curling around ankles and calves, rising slowly with every careful step. At a narrow bend in the trail, the forest opened slightly into another glade. The ground was uneven, scattered with moss-covered boulders, shallow depressions filled with water and fallen branches. Sunlight broke through the canopy in fractured beams, illuminating patches of moss and rock in shifting patterns. Mist curled lazily across the floor, hiding the edges of depressions, hiding what might lurk within. Footprints continued across the glade, pressed lightly into the moss. Tiny toes angled carefully around obstacles. The pulse beneath remained steady, deep, insistent, vibrating through stones and earth alike. Shadows at the periphery crouched and flickered, always watching, never approaching. A shallow stream cut through one edge of the glade. Water ran silently over smooth stones, reflecting light in fractured patterns. Mist rose slowly from the stream's edge, coiling like smoke toward the canopy. Reflections on the water surface revealed shapes elongated. Crouched but, these figures dissolved instantly when the eye tried to focus. Beyond the stream, the forest thickened, forming a corridor of roots, stones, and leaning trunks. The small figure continued, careful, deliberate, each step following a rhythm dictated by the pulse beneath. Mist rose at the edges, curling around legs and shoes, thickening in shadows. The corridor twisted unpredictably. Moss and roots covered almost every inch of the floor. Stones protruded at strange angles. The pulse beneath continued, guiding every step. Shadows flitted, crouched and pale, dissolving when observed. The air was cooler here, heavier, damp with condensation, faintly metallic. A cluster of boulders loomed ahead, stacked as if by ancient hands. The passage narrowed, forcing a crawl. Fingers pressed against rough bark and stone for balance. Boots tested every inch of moss and slick rock. Mist rose higher here, swirling in slow spirals, curling upward as if inhaling. The pulse beneath remained constant, vibrating through stone and root alike. At the end of the narrow corridor, the path opened into a circular clearing, surrounded by dense pines, whose roots twisted like massive serpents into the earth. Light fell in jagged, irregular beams, illuminating moss and wet stone. Mist clung low, curling over roots and rocks, and the pulse beneath resonated in the center of the clearing, stronger, more insistent. The small boots pressed into the soft moss toward the center. Each step was careful, deliberate, precise. Tiny toes angled around stones and roots, fingers brushing moss for balance. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, flitting, disappearing instantly when focus turned. A shallow trickle of water ran across the center, its surface reflecting impossible shapes that bent and shifted unnaturally. Mist rose slowly, curling upward like ghostly tendrils. The footprints ended here, pressed faintly into the moss, showing no continuation beyond. The pulse beneath remained, steady and infinite, vibrating through the stones, the moss, and the soil itself. The clearing fell into silence. Mist drifted, curling in slow spirals around stones and roots. Light fractured through the canopy in uneven beams. Shadows flickered at the edges, crouched, pale, disappearing when fully observed. And beneath it all, the pulse persisted, patient, eternal, unyielding. He forgotten hollow, approximately 1,100 words mist, swirled low over the mossy floor of the clearing. Curling into every hollow, every crevice between ancient roots and rocks, tiny footprints pressed lightly into the damp ground, marking the path with delicate clarity. The pulse beneath the earth persisted, vibrating faintly but steadily, synchronizing with each careful step. The forest around the clearing seemed to shift subtly. Light fractured differently through the dense canopy, branches rearranging in ways the eye could scarcely follow. Shadows stretched and contracted, leaning forward as if pressing into the mist, then retreating when directly observed. The small boots advanced, pressing into moss and wet stones, toes angled to maintain balance on slick surfaces. A fallen tree lay ahead, jagged and slick with condensation. Fingers pressed into bark, testing stability. Toes landed lightly, calculating weight distribution to avoid slipping. Mist curled around knees, ankle high, brushing the edges of clothing. Each movement synchronized with the low pulse beneath, as if the forest guided every step. Beyond the fallen tree, the path ascended slightly, moss giving way to patches of bare stone. Tiny rivulets of water trickled down the incline, reflecting fractured beams of sunlight. Roots twisted along the slope, curling like ancient serpents, and the air grew cooler, damp with condensation. Shapes flitted at the edge of vision, pale, crouched, disappearing when focused on. The corridor narrowed again, forcing the traveler to move carefully between dense trees and leaning boulders. Mist clung to the edges, rising in curling spirals around ankles and calves. Footsteps pressed lightly into the soft soil, leaving faint impressions among the moss and pine needles. The pulse beneath remained, steady, deep, insistent. A shallow stream crossed the path, water barely audible as it trickled over smooth stones. Tiny toes pressed cautiously into the wet surface. Reflections rippled unnaturally, shadows bending and stretching over the water in impossible angles. Mist rose from the stream, curling upward, blending with the thicker fog in the corridor beyond. The corridor opened into another circular hollow, smaller than before. Moss covered every inch of ground, damp and soft. Roots twisted along the edges, curling over boulders, creating obstacles. Light filtered in thin, jagged beams, illuminating stones and moss in fragmented patches. Shapes crouched at the edges, pale and fleeting, appearing only for a moment before vanishing into mist. Footprints continued across the hollow, tiny and precise. Each step measured, deliberate. The pulse beneath persisted, vibrating through stone, moss, and soil alike. The forest seemed aware, arranging itself subtly, ensuring no recognizable landmarks remained, guiding the traveler forward while erasing traces behind. A small incline rose from the far edge, leading toward a shallow rise. The child climbed cautiously, boots testing moss and stone, hands pressing into roots for support. Mist rose higher here, curling around knees, thighs, and fingertips. The pulse beneath remained deep and insistent, echoing up through every contact with the ground. The incline leveled into a narrow corridor formed by two massive boulders leaning toward each other. Mist hugged the edges, curling into the narrow space. Tiny footprints pressed into soft moss, leading forward. Shadows crouched at the periphery, pale, fleeting, impossible to focus on directly. The corridor twisted, forcing careful navigation. At the far end, the corridor opened into a small glade ringed by towering pines. Moss covered every inch of the floor, glistening faintly in filtered sunlight. Mist lingered low, drifting across roots and stones in curling spirals. Footprints pressed lightly toward the center, ending at the edge of a shallow depression where the pulse beneath felt strongest. The forest was still, mist curled, shadows flickered, and the pulse continued, deep, infinite, patient.
Ow.
The shrouded path from the edge of the shallow depression, the forest pressed closer. Ancient pines leaned inward, their trunks so tight that sunlight barely penetrated. Mist clung to the floor, thickening, curling in spirals around roots and rocks. Every step pressed lightly into soft moss, toes and fingers testing the ground, careful, deliberate, precise. The pulse beneath continued steady, insistent, vibrating through every stone, root, and patch of moss. Shapes crouched at the edges, pale, shifting, impossible to focus on directly. They moved only when not observed, like living shadows hiding just beyond perception. The corridor narrowed. Moss-covered roots twisted along the sides, forming near-vertical walls that forced the traveler to crouch. Droplets of condensation fell from overhead needles, striking skin with cold, sharp precision. Tiny boots pressed carefully over slick moss and smooth stone, each step measured against the rhythm of the pulse beneath. Ahead, the narrow path twisted around a cluster of jagged boulders. Mist thickened here, curling and twisting as though alive, drifting around legs and fingertips. Shadows crouched just beyond the mist, pale and fleeting, moving with the slightest shift in light. The pulse beneath echoed, guiding the traveler forward. A small incline led upward, forcing careful climbing. Fingers gripped moss-covered roots and rough stone, toes pressing lightly into slick surfaces. The air grew cooler, damp with condensation and the scent of wet earth and stone. Shapes crouched along the edges, flickering in and out of perception, vanishing instantly when observed. The path leveled briefly into another small glade. Sunlight filtered in fractured beams, illuminating moss and stones in shifting, uneven patterns. The mist curled low, flowing along the ground, clinging to roots, stones, and every inch of moss. Footprints pressed lightly across the glade, tiny and precise, showing careful navigation of obstacles. A shallow stream cut across one edge, its water moving silently over smooth pebbles. Reflections revealed shapes that bent unnaturally, shadows that stretched across the water in impossible angles. Mist rose from the stream in curling spirals, rising higher as the traveler pressed forward. Beyond the stream, the forest thickened, roots and boulders forming a corridor too narrow to walk upright. The child crawled carefully, hands pressing into moss, feet pressing into stone. Mist swirled around ankles and knees. The pulse beneath remained steady, vibrating through every contact with the ground. The corridor twisted sharply, leading to a small clearing surrounded by massive pines. Moss covered every inch of the floor, glistening faintly with moisture. Sunlight pierced through tiny gaps in the canopy, forming fractured beams across the soft ground. Mist lingered, curling around roots and stones like fingers. Footprints pressed lightly toward the center, ending at the edge of a shallow depression. The pulse beneath the soil was strongest here, vibrating in harmony with the movement of the tiny feet. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, moving in and out of perception. Mist curled slowly, thickening slightly, curling into spirals around stones and roots. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting, patient, eternal. A gentle rise at the far edge led into another narrow corridor formed by leaning boulders and twisted roots. The path forced careful navigation, hands and feet pressing into moss and stone. The pulse beneath guided every step. Shadows crouched at the edges, flickering in and out, never approaching. The corridor opened into another circular glade, smaller, denser, darker. Moss covered every inch. Mist hung thick, curling and twisting in slow spirals. Tiny footprints pressed lightly toward the center, ending at a shallow depression where the pulse beneath felt almost alive, strong, rhythmic, infinite. The forest was still. Mist curled, shadows flickered, and the pulse persisted, steady, patient, eternal. The echoing hollow of the glade narrowed into a corridor of massive trees and boulders. Mist hugged the edges, curling along roots and stones in slow spirals. Each footfall pressed lightly into the mossy floor, careful, deliberate, precise. Tiny fingers brushed rough bark, toes tested slick surfaces. Every step synchronized with the steady pulse beneath the earth. Shadows crouched at the periphery of perception, pale, fleeting, impossible to focus on directly. Each step seemed to shift the forest subtly, rearranging trunks and roots, ensuring that no path backward could be traced. Shapes appeared only when not directly observed, vanishing instantly when attention fell upon them. The corridor twisted sharply. Moss and roots rose like walls on either side, forcing the small traveler to crouch, crawl, and lean over obstacles. Condensation dripped from branches overhead, striking skin with cold, precise taps. Each movement was measured, synchronized with the low, insistent pulse beneath. A fallen tree lay across the path. Tiny hands gripped moss-covered bark while toes pressed lightly into the slippery surface. Mist curled around ankles, knees, rising gradually, clinging to every movement. Shadows crouched beyond the edges, disappearing whenever they were observed. The pulse beneath guided forward, deep, rhythmic, eternal. The path ascended sharply, roots and rocks forming uneven steps. Moss and wet stone created treacherous footing. Each careful placement of fingers and toes synchronized with the pulse below. Mist thickened around the small body, curling upward, obscuring details of the forest beyond. Shadows flitted at the edges, pale, crouched, impossible to fully perceive. The incline leveled into a small glade, circular, uneven, with moss-covered stones and shallow depressions. Sunlight broke through the canopy in fractured beams, illuminating scattered patches of the floor. Mist curled over roots and rocks. Footprints pressed lightly into the moss, tiny and precise, showing careful navigation through uneven terrain. A shallow stream cut through one side of the clearing. Water moved slowly over smooth stones, reflecting distorted shadows. Mist rose in spirals, curling around roots and stones, thickening slightly. The footprints continued carefully across the clearing, ending at the edge of a shallow depression. The pulse beneath was strongest here, vibrating in harmony with every movement. The forest seemed alive, shifting subtly around the tiny traveler. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, fleeting, appearing and disappearing in rhythm with the pulse beneath the earth. Mist swirled slowly, curling in spirals, thickening, moving as though alive. A narrow corridor opened at the far edge of the clearing. Moss-covered roots and leaning boulders forced careful passage. Hands pressed into bark, toes tested slick moss and stone. The pulse beneath guided every movement. Mist clung, curling upward around the legs, wrapping around ankles and knees. Shadows crouched at the edges, flitting in and out, impossible to focus on directly. The corridor twisted, then opened into another glade, smaller, denser, darker. Moss covered every inch of the floor, glistening faintly with moisture. Mist hung low, curling and twisting. Footprints pressed lightly across the moss, tiny, precise, deliberate. At the center of the glade, a shallow depression pulsed faintly beneath the earth, synchronized with every step. Shadows crouched at the periphery, flickering in and out. The forest remained silent. Mist curled in slow spirals, drifting across roots and stones. Light fractured through the canopy in thin, jagged beams. The pulse beneath continued steady, deep, eternal, guiding every step, patient, infinite. A rise at the far edge led to a narrow, twisted corridor. Moss, roots, and stones formed obstacles, forcing careful navigation. Each footfall pressed lightly into the soft moss, toes angling around protruding roots. Fingers grasped bark for balance. Mist rose, curling around legs and feet. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, disappearing instantly when observed. The corridor opened into a small circular hollow. Sunlight filtered through jagged gaps in the canopy. Moss covered every inch of the ground. Mist curled in slow spirals. Footprints continued, tiny, precise, deliberate, pressed lightly toward the center. The pulse beneath was strongest here, resonating through stone, moss, and soil alike. The forest waited. Mist drifted, curling over roots and stones. Shadows flickered at the edges, crouched, pale, vanishing when fully observed. And the pulse persisted, deep, infinite, patient, eternal. The veiled clearing, the small corridor, ended abruptly, opening into a wider glade. Moss and stones covered the ground, soft, uneven, glistening with dew. Mist lingered thick, curling into spirals around every root and boulder. Tiny footprints pressed lightly into the moss, leading toward the center of the glade. The pulse beneath the earth remained constant, deep, steady, insistent. Each footfall synchronized with it, every step deliberate, careful, measured. Shadows crouched at the periphery, pale, impossible to focus on directly. They flickered in and out, bending with the shifting light and swirling mist. The glade stretched irregularly. Ancient pines ringed the edges, their trunks thick and leaning, roots twisting over the ground like serpents. Mist rose slowly from the moss, curling around every obstruction, every rock and root, moving almost consciously, alive. A shallow stream cut across one side of the clearing, water gliding silently over smooth stones. The reflections were distorted, revealing shadows that twisted unnaturally across the surface. Mist rose in curling spirals, obscuring the edges of the stream and the forest beyond. Tiny footprints pressed carefully across the moss, navigating around obstacles and water. The pulse beneath intensified slightly, echoing through the moss, roots, and stones. Every step seemed guided by it. Shadows crouched at the edges, flitting just beyond perception. The forest seemed to rearrange itself subtly, ensuring that no path backward could be traced. No landmark remained recognizable. Ahead, a narrow rise led into another corridor, twisted and uneven. Moss-covered stones and roots. Hands pressed into bark, toes tested slippery surfaces. Mist clung to ankles and knees, curling upward with every movement. Shapes crouched at the periphery, pale and fleeting, vanishing instantly when observed. The corridor twisted sharply. Tiny boots pressed lightly into moss, careful not to slip. Roots protruded from the ground, forcing careful navigation. Moss shifted underfoot, slick with condensation. The pulse beneath guided every movement, deep, insistent, infinite. The corridor opened into another circular hollow, smaller and denser. Moss covered every inch of the floor. Sunlight filtered in fractured beams, illuminating stones and roots. Mist lingered low, curling slowly around every surface. Footprints pressed lightly toward the center, ending at a shallow depression where the pulse beneath was strongest. The air grew cooler. Condensation dripped from needles overhead, striking skin with cold precision. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale and fleeting, impossible to focus on. The mist thickened, curling higher, obscuring details of the moss and stones. The pulse beneath resonated through the hollow, vibrating faintly, echoing through the earth, patient and eternal. A rise at the far edge led to another narrow passage formed by leaning boulders and twisted roots. The child crawled carefully, fingers pressing into moss and stone for balance, toes testing every surface. Mist curled around legs, rising slowly, wrapping tightly. Shadows flitted at the periphery, pale and crouched, disappearing instantly when observed. At the passage's end, the forest opened into a final circular clearing. Moss covered every inch, wet and soft. This lingered low, curling and drifting over roots and stones. Sunlight pierced the canopy in thin fractured beams, casting shifting light across the glade. Footprints pressed lightly into the moss, tiny and precise, ending near the center at a shallow depression. The pulse beneath was strongest here, deep, infinite, synchronized with every movement, guiding every step. Shadows crouched at the edges, flitting in and out. Mist curled in slow spirals, drifting across roots and stones. The forest waited, silent, patient, eternal. The vanishing, the final clearing lay silent, shrouded in mist. Moss covered the floor, slick and glistening with dew. Roots twisted along the edges like grasping fingers, curling over stones and creating uneven obstacles. The small footprints pressed carefully across the ground, tiny and precise, ending near the center at a shallow depression where the pulse beneath was strongest. Mist swirled slowly, curling around roots, stones, and the soft, mossy floor. Sunlight filtered in fractured beams, jagged and uneven, illuminating patches of the ground while leaving other areas shrouded in deep shadow. The air was cooler here, heavy with condensation, smelling faintly of wet stone and pine. The pulse beneath continued, deep, steady, patient. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale and fleeting, flitting in and out of perception. Each movement dissolved them instantly, leaving only distortions in the mist. Slight ripples across the moss, subtle shifts in air and light. The forest seemed aware, alive, responding to the presence of the small traveler, guiding forward while erasing traces behind. The shallow depression at the center of the clearing pulsed faintly beneath the earth. Moss flattened, pine needles arranged in subtle arcs, concentric patterns pressed into the soft soil. Tiny toes angled carefully around obstacles, fingers brushing moss and roots. Each step measured, deliberate, synchronized with the low, insistent pulse. A thin stream cut across the edge of the clearing. Water flowed silently over smooth stones, reflecting shadows that bent unnaturally across the surface. Mist rose from the stream in curling spirals, merging with the thicker fog around the clearing. Tiny footprints pressed carefully across moss, ending abruptly at the stream's edge. The pulse beneath intensified, resonating through stone, moss, and earth alike. Every step forward was guided by it, every movement synchronized with the rhythm it maintained. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, flitting in and out, never approaching, merely observing, waiting. Beyond the stream, the corridor narrowed into a tight passage formed by leaning boulders and twisted roots. Moss and roots twisted across the floor, creating obstacles requiring careful navigation. Hands pressed into rough bark. Toes tested slick surfaces. Mist curled around legs and feet, rising slowly, clinging to clothing. Shadows crouched at the edges, flickering in and out of perception. The narrow passage twisted sharply, forcing the small traveler to crawl, stoop, and shift along the uneven ground. Tiny footprints pressed into moss and soil, navigating carefully around rocks and roots. The pulse beneath remained steady, insistent, echoing faintly through stone and earth. Mist thickened, curling around legs and fingertips, obscuring everything beyond immediate sight. At the far end, the passage opened into a secluded hollow, smaller, denser, darker. Ancient pines formed a tight perimeter, their roots curling over the moss-covered floor. Light filtered in thin shards, illuminating patches of stone and roots. Mist lingered low, curling and drifting. Footprints pressed lightly toward the center, ending near the heart of the hollow at a shallow depression where the pulse beneath was strongest. The air grew colder, heavy with moisture. Condensation fell from branches overhead, striking skin with sharp, cold taps. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale and fleeting. Mist thickened, rising in slow spirals, curling higher toward the canopy. The pulse beneath resonated strongly, synchronized with every tiny movement, guiding, patient, eternal. The small boots pressed into the moss at the edge of the depression. Each step was careful, deliberate, measured. Tiny toes angled around roots, fingers brushing moss for balance. Shadows crouched at the periphery, pale, fleeting, disappearing instantly when observed. Mist curled higher, thicker, moving almost consciously around every surface. The shallow depression at the center of the hollow seemed to breathe. Moss flattened subtly, pine needles rearranged themselves in faint arcs. The pulse beneath the soil intensified, echoing through stone, roots, and moss alike. Footprints pressed lightly into the ground, ending here. No further trace. The child had disappeared, absorbed into the pulse, the mist, the forest itself. Mist rose in thick spirals around the shallow depression. Shadows crouched at the edges, pale, flickering in and out, bending with the shifting light. The forest held its breath, patient and eternal. The pulse beneath continued, deep, steady, infinite, echoing silently through stone, roots, and moss. The small footprints left no continuation beyond the hollow. Moss and soil showed no other disturbance. The forest waited. Mist curled slowly. Shadows flitted at the periphery, crouched pale, vanishing when fully observed. Sunlight fractured through the canopy, jagged beams cutting across the floor, illuminating nothing but stillness. The shallow depression pulsed beneath the earth, faint but insistent. The forest seemed to hum with it, the rocks, roots, and moss, vibrating subtly in unison. Every step, every movement had been guided, every obstacle negotiated in harmony with it. And now, at the center of the hidden hollow, it all ceased to move. Footprints ended, mist lingered. Shadows crouched, flickering, watching, then fading. Silence filled the clearing. The pulse persisted, steady, patient, eternal. Moss and pine needles lay undisturbed. Stones glistened with condensation. Mist drifted in slow, curling spirals. The forest waited, infinite and unyielding. Holding its breath, the small traveler gone. absorbed into the hidden heart of the woods. The roaring river murmured far below, distant and muffled, a reminder of the world beyond. Birds called faintly in the distance, then all sound fell silent. Light shifted slowly across the canopy, casting fractured patterns on moss and stones. The pulse beneath continued, steady, deep, eternal. And in the heart of the forest, the hidden hollow remained. Mist curled in slow spirals. Shadows crouched at the edges, then vanished. Footprints ended. The pulse beneath persisted, infinite, patient, unyielding. The forest held its secrets, silent and eternal, the disappearance complete. As we reach the end of this journey through some of the most chilling, puzzling, and haunting real-life crimes and mysterious deaths in history, one truth becomes clear. The line between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy is thinner than we think. From the desperate survival of those abducted against all odds to the unexplained forces that claimed the lives of entire families or left bodies without answers, these stories remind us of the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. Some mysteries may never be solved. Some perpetrators may never face justice. And yet the courage, cunning, and endurance of the victims continue to inspire us, teaching lessons about vigilance, hope, and survival. History is full of darkness, but through these stories we honor those who endured, those who disappeared, and those who left questions that echo through time. If these stories captivated you, make sure to like this video to show your support. Subscribe to the channel for more real-life mysteries and true crime stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Comment below on which story shocked or intrigued you the most. And share this video with friends who are fascinated by true crime and unsolved mysteries. Because for every unsolved crime, for every mysterious death, there is a story waiting to be told, then the truth, in some way, always demands to be remembered.